Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to It's Rainmaking Time. It's such a divine pleasure to welcome back Dr. Edwin Vieira. I've had the great pleasure of interviewing him for many, many years, and never more have we needed a constitutional, not just a constitutional scholar, a master, an attorney, but somebody who's coming on with 57 years of focus and expertise in this area. The United States needs his expertise and his understanding in this focused area more than ever. And in my experience, watching people online and on the news and just talking in general about the U.S. Constitution, most of us don't understand it, most of us have not read it, and most of us throw the word around and the document around like we know what we're talking about. Dr. Viera is a PhD and a JD, and one of the most important legal minds of the realm. He has fought Supreme Court cases, successfully argued and briefed. The following three cases are Abood versus Detroit Board of Education, the Chicago Teachers Union versus Hudson, Communications Workers of America versus Beck. He has also authored many books. I'm just going to share a few before we bring him on to keep this succinct. Constitutional Homeland Security and a Nation in Arms, How to Dethrone the Judiciary, 3 Rights, 13 Words, this powerhouse book called Pieces of 8, The Monetary Powers and Disabilities of the United States Constitution, the Sword and Sovereignty, the Constitutional Principles of the Militia of Several States. It is my great pleasure at this very delicate time in U.S. history to bring on Dr. Edwin Vieira. Welcome to It's Rainmaking Time.
Well, thank you, Kim. It's my pleasure to be here.
I'm concerned that the U.S. could revisit not just protests, but riots all over the country. A lot of people are very anxious and very worried about it. And I think the first thing that would be very helpful for you to distill is what is the distinction between a riot and a protest? And I will intervene as you explain it to distill it more to the public.
Well, starting with a protest, the normal connotation of that is people peacefully marching or otherwise demonstrating in the exercise of their First Amendment rights of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government. Now, even that type of behavior may be subject to some kind of regulation, as for instance in the use of public streets. It may be required that a protest march, so-called, would obtain a permit to use the streets because the streets might be closed for that march. So it's not something that, because it's under the First Amendment protection, it might not be subject to regulation. Now, if we're talking about a riot, that may have aspects of a protest, but it's always understood to have behavior that is violent or otherwise criminal in nature. And it usually can be suppressed, let's put it that way, through the use of the criminal procedures, and typically at the beginning the use of police authority to arrest individuals. Right? It may rise to the level at which armed forces of one kind or another, talking about the militia, National Guard in this country in particular, might be called in. Depends on the scale of the riot, the number of people who are involved, what kind of damage to property or to persons is going on. And then at the next level is insurrection, where a riot becomes part of an attempt to overthrow in whole or in part some government or some governmental policy. So it depends upon what level you are in terms of the behavior of the parties.
But who determines that?
Well, initially it will be the law enforcement authorities. Whoever has the ability to make a determination that the public peace is or is not being threatened by the activity of these individuals. So sometimes it can be a close call where a protest on the fringes may have aspects of riot, certain individuals engaged in force or violence or other kinds of illegal activity. The protest as a whole is protected by the First Amendment. The activity by those specific individuals is not. It may be subject to criminal prosecution. Or the activity of those individuals becomes so widespread throughout the protest that the entire protest now takes on the aspect of a riot or an insurrectionary activity.
And isn't that what always happens? A lot of times it happens because the few jeopardize the many, like the many are exercising their First Amendment rights, for example, and then the few come in and disturb that and change the nature of that protest. And then it becomes a riot.
That's right. And they try and take advantage of the protest for their own nefarious purposes. The protest is not designed to engage in riotous behavior. They want to take the advantage that these people have all been assembled in order to turn it in that direction.
All right. So let me bring up something a little bit controversial about this, in my estimation. The media networks, the television networks, they're in the business of advertising. They're really not in the business of content. They're in the business of advertising. In fact, somebody at NBC told me that. And I remember saying, "What, you mean you're in the business of advertising?" He goes, "Yes." And I said, "Then what's the news?" And he looked me in the face and he said, "It's Phil, nothing but Phil, Kim. You mean you didn't know that?" And I said, "No, I didn't know that." That was back in 2000, like between 10 and 12. So if the networks are in the business of advertising and what they need to be whole and profitable is ratings, how do we know that the clips, and I want you to respond to this, how do we know that the clips they're capturing of what it either is in large part or in small part, the few that are poisoning the really honest protesters that are there saying, "No, I don't like this," or "I don't like that," and exercising their First Amendment right? But it looks, when you see it on TV, that it's going on everywhere. Mm-hmm. And this is the problem we face with a media that is designed to boost their advertising and ratings based on crisis and based on emergencies and like deaths and horrible things.
Well, it may go both ways. That on the one hand, some people in the media will find it to their advantage or the advantage of the business to maximize the aspects of the protests that are riotous in nature. But on the other hand, it may also be in their interest ideologically to minimize that and to take a protest that is largely riotous or is directed in a riotous behavior and try to pretend that it's actually peaceful. And once again, it depends upon the totality of the circumstances, as the courts like to say. You have to look at every one of these situations from different perspectives and try to gain a sense of the whole, as opposed to, the old story of the blind man feeling the elephant.
Yeah, and
right?
only get one part.
And that's exactly the problem that you have sometimes here, because the media personalities at different levels of that structure may have different ideological purposes, may they have different business purposes, and you have to really get behind that and ask, well, why is he looking, this reporter, why is he solely looking at this part of the protest and saying it's peaceful when just down the street there are cars and businesses burning?
Mm-hmm.
Remember the famous event from the protest in 2020 where the reporter is standing in front of a large building totally engulfed in flame and talking about how this is largely a peaceful protest, when you can look directly behind him and see, well, buildings are on fire. So what was his ideological bent? What was his maybe business interest in presenting this? One would have to look at that reporter and be very skeptical of why he was presenting the image behind himself in this verbal way, which is really not descriptive of what was going on.
So I'm going to ask you some tough questions about this. When does someone like you determine that a protest, an honest protest of people that are upset, become a riot? What is the constitutional framework for that?
Well, it's really a practical question of whether the level of illegal activity is sufficiently pervasive through the protests, and the purpose of the protesters is, well, it might simply be destruction of property. It might simply be to oppose some governmental policy, whatever. We have to look at that ultimate purpose. It might be ideological and political. And somebody has to make that determination. Why are these people here? What is their purpose? Are they attempting to obtain their goal through the use of some kind of illegal, particularly violent activity? And to what level does that rise? Are we talking about just a few isolated pockets among a large group of people? Or is this spread throughout the group? And perhaps it's been organized by a group that has that ultimate purpose in mind, or has publicized that that's their ultimate purpose. So it's pretty much a question of ad hoc determination. You can't necessarily say that it's a riot as opposed to a peaceful protest unless you add up all of these incidents or elements of the event and make an evaluation.
Okay, so let's take the protests that have been going on in Los Angeles, my former hometown, in California. I want to get to what kind of authority does a governor, we'll use, let's say Governor Newsom, what kind of authority, constitutional authority, does he have or not have in this instance to make the call, is it peaceful or not peaceful? This is what the big rift is about publicly, the optics of it and the discourse going on all over the media.
Well, typically governors have the authority as governors in executing the laws of their particular state to make that kind of a determination. And once again, the determination may be limited to parts of the protest and not the protest as a whole. Right? So if there are areas in which the protesters are burning cars, breaking into stores, looting and so forth, throwing stones or bricks at police or what have you, then the governor makes a determination this is a riot. And there will be a state statute, typically, that will enable the governor to make a proclamation based on his determination that that's what this event involves. And generally speaking, the courts don't get involved in that initial determination. They may come up later on and say that some people have been arrested or whatever by the police improperly, that those people were involved in the riotous aspect of the event. But the courts are not going to come in initially and tell the governor, no, you can't declare this is a riot and call the police in when the circumstances are such that it falls within the general definition that the statutes lay out as activity that must be suppressed by police action.
But given what's gone on the last maybe 10, 12, 15 years, it seems to me that the bad few can infect the whole so as to make it impossible to do a real protest.
Well,
it's possible.
Sure. Well,
you can get 100 people in a 10,000 person protest. You start burning cars, breaking into stores, throwing bricks, blah, 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 and then the whole thing is infected.
And that's right. And that's the problem, the practical problem. When that infection rises to a sufficient level in the protests, which might have been initially peaceful and constitutional, unfortunately, the only action that the police can take is to suppress most of the protest activity. They have no choice because their first obligation is to maintain protection of persons and property. So these bad apples in the bunch do necessarily rot the entire bunch under those circumstances.
And do protesters have any constitutional standing to walk and fill the streets and stop traffic?
No, typically not. Because when a protest, let's say you're going to have a march
right,
on behalf of some ideological cause, and they want to march down Main Street. And the Supreme Court has said, well, the First Amendment activity can be regulated with respect to time and manner. You can't simply march anywhere at any time for any purpose under the First Amendment in such a way as to, let's say, discombobulate the normal life of the community. So typically what a community will have is some kind of regulation that deals with permitting a march on the streets during a particular period of time from here to there. And the activity of the individuals has to be, they can have placards, they can chant, whatever. And that's all going to be legitimate. Think of it typically situation where you have union picketing activity.
Right.
The unions are outside in front of the plant.
Like for the entertainment industry,
right?
I remember that.
And they're carrying placards, Gizmo Business Corporation, unfair, we want razor wages or whatever, their demands are met. Well, as long as they're doing that, even on a public sidewalk or on a public street, and they have the appropriate permits for time, place, and manner, that's protected by the First Amendment. As soon as they begin to get into verbal or especially physical scuffles with employees who are trying to cross the picket line to go and work in the plant, now we have a problem that may involve police intervention. That's no longer simply a peaceful protest or union strike activity. That's risen to the level of something that may be pre-riot, or in some of those cases, it becomes a riot. Enough people are involved. Same is true with any kind of so-called protest or ideological demonstration. Let's just call it
Right.
a
Okay.
demonstration.
Well, what about like last few days going down the 101 freeway? God, I lived in Los Angeles my whole life, most of my life. It was completely. They were at a dead stop. Nobody could move. Nobody could pass. Nobody could get home. Nobody could go back and forth to work.
I would imagine, I don't have the laws of the city of Los Angeles in front of me, but I would imagine under the laws of the city of Los Angeles,
Yeah.
and probably California law or the county in which Los Angeles is, that's all illegal. That they certainly could never get a permit for the kind of activity that you're describing, where they could block off major thoroughfares.
So what could the mayor of Los Angeles, Karen Bass, what could or should she have done at that point?
Well, when they see it rise to that level, or perhaps a little bit before, typically what the chief executive in the jurisdiction would do would be to make a proclamation or some other declaration, there's usually a provision for that, and call upon these people through the police authorities to disperse, or maybe to get out of the way of the traffic or whatever, and especially if they didn't have a permit. All right, this was a non-permitted activity.
Can a group of any kind or a community get a permit to block traffic in a
Well,
regular
no,
day?
not in the sense that you're raising. I mean, obviously, if they're marching down the street, there would be no traffic. They would have a permit to have a parade.
Right.
All right. But as soon as they say, well, what we're going to do is not have a permitted parade, we're going to go up on some thoroughfare and simply block traffic for whatever number of hours in order to bring our protest home to the citizens of L.A. or whatever. At that point, the authority of the executive branch, including the police, comes into play.
Yeah.
And there are certainly statutes that cover events of that kind and make them illegal in some sense.
Now, what if the law enforcement was told to stand down and not activate, don't arrest people, don't hurt people, don't handcuff people who are blocking the freeways? What if? I'm not saying that's happened, but I'm saying...
No, it depends how far it goes. If it's done in a prudential fashion to see if, well, we let these people go and march there for an hour or so and then disperse, because the alternative will be to have a confrontation with the police and raise the level of potential violence.
Mm-hmm.
But if what's actually happening is the protesters intend to occupy that street for an indefinite period of time, in clear violation of what the laws are with respect to demonstrations and marches and so forth, then at some stage the governor would have to say, or the mayor of the town would have to say, well, we need to move the police in to remove these people.
But, I mean, is it okay to block traffic for hours on end with people sitting in their cars?
Absolutely not. I can't imagine how you would get a permit for that kind of a demonstration, especially on a major artery, major thoroughfare where emergency vehicles would be moving and so forth. Absolutely not.
Okay, so now, you said to me in one of our recent talks that presidential authority, there's a statute about it to deal with state officials failing to take certain actions. What is that?
Well, let's go back one step.
Okay.
The Constitution provides that the government of the United States can protect, is in fact required to protect states against domestic violence. And when the Constitution is talking about domestic violence, it means violation of state law.
Okay.
Riots that are in violation of state law. But the duty of the United States to do that is contingent upon, and I can read it from the Constitution, it's contingent upon application of the legislature of the state or of the executive when the legislature cannot be convened. So if there's a riot going on in Los Angeles or whatever, and it's entirely a matter of state law violations, the United States government cannot intervene unless the governor or the legislature of California ask for that. And there is a federal statute, Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 251, Federal Aid for State Governments, which gives the president, upon the request of the legislature or the governor, to call into federal service such of the militia of the states or the armed forces to suppress that insurrection, all right? However, what we're talking about, what's going on in the country today, is not simply interference with state law, a violation of state law. It's interference in violation with federal law, immigration law. The states have no authority with respect to immigration law, per se. That's a power of Congress, and Congress has passed all sorts of statutes. And so what actually applies there is a statute, Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253, when the president can call up the militia or the armed forces or both, or by any other means, I understand, or by any other means, he can take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, domestic violence, unlawful combination, or conspiracy if it so hinders the execution of the laws of the state and of the United States within the state that any part or class of its people is deprived of a right, privilege, immunity, or protection named in the Constitution and secured by law, and the constituted authorities of the state are unable, fail, or refuse to protect that right, privilege, or immunity, or to give that protection. So every citizen in, let's take Los Angeles, has a federal constitutional right to property, personal security, life. We could go on. All right. And here we have these riots or violent domestic disturbances taking place, which
by the way, was denied. In other words, this has been officially either downplayed or denied as being not real.
Well, all right, and that's the point I'm going to make.
Okay.
These things are going on, and you can see them going on, all right? And the state officials are failing to take action to prevent or to deal with these problems when they actually have the authority to do so. In fact, they're going to the extreme of saying it's not happening at all. Under those circumstances, the President of the United States may directly intervene. Why? Because what is the source of the problem? It's people who are rioting or demonstrating in a violent manner against what? The enforcement of the immigration laws, the enforcement of federal law. So when the enforcement of federal law is involved, the governor of the state has nothing whatsoever to do with the decision. The president himself can intervene through the use of the militia, the armed forces, or in any other way to suppress this domestic insurrection.
And you're using the word insurrection now. You've seen so many people use that word out in the public. I want you to describe what is an insurrection, because I think most of us don't. We have a feeling about what it is, but we don't know what it is.
Well, let me just go back to the statute, because the statute talks about insurrection, domestic violence. Let's forget the word insurrection just for the moment.
Okay.
What's going on there is clearly domestic violence, whether you call it insurrection or not. Unlawful combination, people unlawfully getting together in the streets to perform unlawful activity. Now, if we go to insurrection, we're typically thinking about someone who is engaged in domestic violence aimed at the overthrow of a government in whole or in part. Now, it could be in part, which is what's going on here, because people are trying to prevent the enforcement of the laws of the United States with respect to immigration. That's what this is all about. Interference with the immigration authorities in apprehending illegal aliens or whatever else they're doing there. So it's an insurrection to that extent. They have chosen to oppose the enforcement of the laws of the United States.
But by the First Amendment, don't they have a right to oppose it?
Well, there's opposition. If you oppose verbally,
Right.
say, I'm opposed to this. If you march in the streets peacefully with placards, say, I'm opposed to this. If you go on network news,
right.
You go on the internet and you say, I'm opposed to this, that's fine. But when you go beyond opposition and you link opposition of a verbal nature, of an ideological nature, with actual violent activity, you're no longer protected by the First Amendment. Let me give you the example, the famous case Brandenburg versus Ohio, where Brandenburg was an agitator who was agitating for the overthrow of the government. He was a seditionist. And he was arrested under an Ohio law for that reason. He was advocating the violent overthrow of the government. And the Supreme Court ruled, well, there's a difference between advocating the violent overthrow of the government and actually engaging or encouraging imminent violent action. So, picture that comes to my mind, if you're standing on a soapbox in the Boston Common and you're saying the Massachusetts legislature should be overthrown by force and violence, that's protected by the First Amendment. If you start handing out pitchforks and torches and encourage your listeners to march up the hill and actually overthrow the Massachusetts legislature, that is not protected. So in Brandenburg's case, he was simply advocating. He was advocating very extreme measures, but he was simply advocating. First Amendment protected that. If he had gone to the next step and encouraged in one way or another actual physical activity, then the First Amendment would have not protected him at all.
Okay. So, for example, I witnessed bricks being thrown, really big bricks, onto cars. I think they were police cars. Okay. And all these bricks are being delivered into Los Angeles in pallets. And so could the bricks be considered the pitchforks in this case?
Well, of course they would be, because what are they being used for? They're being used for the same purpose as the pitchforks. They're stoning police cars or destroying businesses, persons, property. All right. And what's interesting about this statute that gives the president authority.
What statute? Name the
this
number.
This is Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253.
Okay.
I mean, apparently people like Gavin Newsom are talking about Section 251 of Title 10.
What is that?
That's where the governor has the authority. He doesn't have to request the president, or let's put it the other way around. The president can't intervene unless he has a request coming from the governor. And that's because you're dealing in that situation only with violations of state law. When you have violations of federal law, which is Title 10, Section 253, now the president can intervene without any involvement of the governor.
But is it based on the subject? In other words, the protest isn't violating the law. It's the violence
it's
at
the violence.
The protest.
It's got nothing to do with the subject.
Okay. All right. I just want to make sure.
And the point of this statute is it says the president may intervene. He may take such measures as he considers necessary to suppress in a state any insurrection, which could be, depending on how you look at it, domestic violence, which it certainly is, unlawful combination, which it certainly is, people getting together, or conspiracy. And that brings us back to the bricks. Who is providing the bricks? Who paid for the bricks? Who delivered the bricks into the hands of the people who were using them unlawfully to hurl at businesses or police cars or whatever, to use them as missiles of personal or property destruction, right? All those people are involved in a conspiracy. So the president would have the authority not simply to come in and intervene in this situation to stop the actual riotous behavior, but to investigate who was involved behind the scenes in preparing and paying for and instigating this. Who was the Brandenburg character who was not only advocating violent overthrow of the government, but was actually handing out the pitchforks and the torches?
Okay. All right.
I just say, you see how broad that statute is.
Yes.
And it does not require the approval of the governor of the state.
That's the big piece of confusion, because the news is reporting that there's this trespassing of standing and rights and jurisdiction, jurisdiction of one's role. So you also talked to me about a famous case called, is it Martin versus Mott?
Martin versus Mott. Yes,
I want you to talk about that in the context of when, well, you just go ahead and talk about that case, because that case seems to be like pivotal in terms of what's going on.
Right. Well, you can see how this Title 10, Section 253 statute was written in terms of Martin versus Mott, because it talks about the president by any means shall take such measures as he considers necessary. Now, if you go back to Martin versus Mott, that was a case decided in 1827.
Share that with us.
1827.
Yeah,
right?
Share the case.
And it was written, the opinion was written by Justice Story, who was one of the most famous justices in the Supreme Court throughout history. And it dealt with a statute that was enacted in 1795, so we're talking right at the beginning of our country, when many of the famous patriots were actually members of Congress. And this gave similar authority to the president in terms of a situation where there might be an invasion or a threat of invasion. The president was given the authority to call forth the militia to deal with that situation. And the question was, could anyone contest the decision of the president? Basically, could someone take this to court and say, well, the president isn't authorized under these circumstances to do it? And the Supreme Court said, well, no, he has authority. He's the chief executive. By the Constitution, he's commander-in-chief of the militia. It is his duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. These are all provisions in the Constitution. And then I'm going to quote from the opinion. He is necessarily constituted the judge of the existence of the exigency in the first instance, and is bound to act according to his belief of the facts. If he does so act and decides to call forth the militia, his orders for this purpose are in strict conformity with the provisions of the law, and it would seem to follow as a necessary consequence that every act done by a subordinate officer in obedience to such orders is equally justifiable. The law contemplates that under such circumstances, orders shall be given to carry the power into effect, and it cannot therefore be a correct inference that any person has a just right to disobey them. The law does not provide for any appeal from the judgment of the President, or for any right in subordinate officers to review his decision and in effect to defeat it. And that includes the Supreme Court of the United States, because this case was brought eventually to the Supreme Court, asking for the court to intervene, and the court said, we can't do it. Nobody can do it under this statute. Now, this is essentially the statute they were talking about in 1827, which was written in 1795, is in principle essentially the same as the statute I'm talking about now. Title 10 of the U.S. Code, Section 253, gives the same powers to the President to make this determination. There's the language, shall take such measures as he considers necessary. That's the quote from the statute. So that ties in directly to this opinion of the Supreme Court, which was upholding that principle of presidential power. So anyone, whether it's the governor of California or some member of Congress or whomever, to be saying, well, we have the authority to override the president or to prevent him from doing this, or we have the right to go to court and have some court determine that he can't do this, they're completely wrong. It's already decided. It's decided in 1827 on the basic principle of the presidential authority and the language of the statute. We have the same presidential authority. Actually, it's broader. In this case, I would say the authority is broader than the one in the 1795 statute.
So I'm not trying to put words in your mouth or to, say a misguided statement, but in a sense, is presidential authority in this context absolute? Emphatically, yes.
Well,
that's my question.
Yes,
is it
it's
absolute?
absolute in the legal sense that there's no one who can intervene to contradict the president or stop him from acting, as long as he's acting under the parameters of the statute.
Okay. That's what I wanted to. That's what I wanted.
Now, if he goes outside the limits of the statute, that's another question. We can, deal with exactly what he's done there.
Okay.
But as long as he's within the statute, that's it.
Okay. You talked about the militia and the National Guard, but there's a National Guard in each state, and he's brought in the National Guard from another part of California. I guess it's 29 Palms.
Or another state.
Or another state. I don't know about that.
Or another state.
But he's also called in the Marines.
Mm-hmm.
And this scares people because the Marines are considered like the tip of the spear in terms of their capability of what they can do and how quickly they can stop violence.
Well, rightly so.
So there are a lot of people that say that this is a form of militarization that's unnecessary. What say you?
Well, let's go back to what the statute says first. The president, by using the militia or the armed forces or both or by any other means. Now, that's pretty broad. And the armed forces include the Army, the Marines. The Marines are actually part of the Navy, but they're part of the armed forces, the typical use of that word. The Air Force, I guess. So it's clear that he could use the militia or the armed forces, so he could use the militia or the Marines. And what militia are we talking about? Well, typically today, if you look at, again, the statute, Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 246, militia is the title. There's the organized militia, which consists of the National Guard. So there we have it. He can use the militia under this statute, Section 253, and under 246, the National Guard is considered by Congress to be the organized militia. All right? That solves that problem. And then there's something called the unorganized militia, which basically consists of everyone else from 17 to 45 years of age. So theoretically, the president could start calling up people in the unorganized militia. And I would say, think about the problem here. You send in the police, and then they're insufficient. You send in the National Guard to support the police. Well, anyone who has had any experience with any kind of military or quasi-military operations realizes that the people who are on the front lines with dealing with the problem are always a small percentage of the total operation.
Right.
You have a large logistical train behind them of one kind of support or another. Well, that's where these unorganized militia would come into play. I would, if I were the president, I'd be calling up people from the unorganized militia to deal with the logistical problems of supply, maybe interviewing people who were arrested under these circumstances, doing that kind of preliminary work, maybe medical, other kinds of support activities. How many people could he call upon? Well, let's just take Virginia. Virginia has essentially 4 million people who are eligible to be called up in the unorganized militia, just this state alone. I don't know how many people there would be in California, certainly more than that.
To be considered like unorganized militia, does one have to be called upon by the president? How does it work?
Well, it's in the statute. So let's take Virginia. Virginia, the unorganized militia consists of everyone from 16 to 50, every able-bodied resident from 16 to 55 years of age who is not a member of the National Guard and is not a member of the Virginia Defense Force.
But who has the standing, the authority to call upon the militia in this context?
Well, number one, the governor of Virginia. But number two, the President of the United States, because the statute, Title 10, Section 246, names all of these people from 17 to 45 as members of the unorganized militia as far as Congress is concerned. And those are the people the president would call up. Out of the unorganized militia of Virginia, he could call up people from 17 to 45 years of age.
Okay.
Now, I would imagine he would go to the governor and say, Governor, you have the authority to call these people up, and I want you to call them up for this service. To put them
and
under
what
my
if
command.
the governor says no?
Then the president would just call them up because he has the power to do so directly.
What does calling them up mean? How does that work?
Well, it's
in today's world.
Well, it's difficult to say. Obviously, there are chains of command directly connected to the National Guard, so there's no problem there. If you're talking about the unorganized militia, most states have kind of left that in a moribund state. Mm-hmm. In Virginia, if the governor called them up, it's not exactly clear what he would do. Send people an email, make a proclamation, whatever, because the statute doesn't say, and if you ask for regulations, which I have asked for, they don't have them. However, if you are called up for militia service in the unorganized militia by the governor and you fail to appear, you can be court-martialed.
And what does that mean?
Military trial for dereliction of duty. Oh, you can laugh about it, but that's the reality. The militia is a quasi-military organization, right? So if the governor had a way of doing this...
Most people don't even know they're militia.
Of course they don't know anything about it. All right. But if the governor had a way of doing this, and I'm too old, but assuming that I was less than 55 years old, okay, and he sent me a notice in some way, text message or whatever, and I was supposed to appear at a certain place at a certain time to perform militia duty, and I didn't show up, I could be court-martialed under the Uniform Code of Military Justice.
But what happens? Do you go to jail or what?
Oh, yeah, possibly, or fined.
Okay.
Yeah, okay.
All right.
Now, the president, of course, can do this, but whom would he call initially? He would call the organized militia, which is the National Guard. And so you have people complaining about the National Guard being called up. This is militarization. Well, the statute calls them the organized militia. This is the militia. This is not the army. Now, the National Guard people have a dual role because they are also reserve components of the Army. That's the peculiarity of the National Guard. They're not really militia in the constitutional sense. They're the troops that the states may keep in time of peace with the consent of Congress pursuant to Article 10, Section 1, Clause 3 of the Constitution. We have three types of military service in this country. We have the regular armed forces, Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force. We have this peculiar thing in the middle called the National Guard, which are actually state troops under Article 1, Section 10, Clause 3. But Congress calls them the organized militia, and I can go back in the history of that. It's not necessary. Kind of a confused situation. And then there's everybody else, which are part of the thing that the Constitution calls the militia of the several states. There are 50 of those, one in each state. And Congress calls those people, to distinguish them from the National Guard, the unorganized militia. If you go into the state statutes, you'll find sometimes they call the unorganized militia. That's the way it is in Virginia. Sometimes they call the reserve militia. That's the way it is in Texas, for instance. But it's the same people we're talking about.
Okay.
So the president can call upon those people because the statute that I cited to you says that he can use the militia or the armed forces. So he can use the armed forces, in this case the Marines. He can use the militia, organized militia, the National Guard. He can use the unorganized militia, whomever he might be able to call out of these bodies of regular citizens who don't realize that they're subject to being called up for this kind of service, but they are. And I would think if I were the president, I would have already had a plan saying, well, I'm going to call up the National Guard. The National Guard is going to support the local police because I'm sure there were protocols that deal with that. They have that all arranged. But I have this big logistical train in the back. And I don't want to call upon too many people from the National Guard because they have other things to do, or the regular armed forces. So I'm going to start utilizing this thing called the unorganized militia. And I'll put out a request for people to have this kind of skill, and that kind of skill, and that kind of skill. And initially volunteers. And I'll go to the governors of various states. Now, Gavin Newsom wouldn't cooperate, but there are other states that would. I'll go to the governor and say, I want you to call up some people with these kinds of skills as volunteers, and we'll pay them. And here's how you're going to put out a proclamation, and here's how you're going to contact people.
Who pays them?
Well, I think in this case it would be the federal government.
Coming out of the Treasury? Or
Yeah, coming out of the U.S. Treasury,
okay.
just the way they would be paying National Guard or armed forces people. Or maybe a lot of police who are getting subsidies from the federal government one way or the other.
All right.
Okay.
Now I want to get to the Marines.
The Marines, yeah.
There's confusion in the mind of millions of people in the United States about the Marines being called when the National Guard was already there. What is your take on this? What does the Constitution say about it? Because I remember in our pre-production conversation by phone, you were explaining to me that the Marines are, this is constitutional. You just got done explaining the authority of the president. But to the lay public, who is not aware of the Constitution, it looks like it's a military regime.
Well, it's...
Or, they're calling the president a tyrant.
Right.
It looks tyrannical. Whether it is or not, that's what I'm asking you. Is it tyrannical?
Well, he would be a tyrant if he were acting outside of the law. Right? If you're acting on his own initiative, doing things that are unlawful. That's what tyrants do. They do things that are unlawful.
Okay.
Right? Whatever they are. Whatever things they do. But we've just been through this statute in which Congress has given the president the power by using the militia or the armed forces, or both, or by any other means. That's pretty broad.
Okay.
The Marines are part of the armed forces.
Yeah.
So the statute gives the president the authority to use the Marines. So he cannot possibly be tyrannical in the sense of following the statute unless you were to say, well, this statute is unconstitutional. The armed forces could never be used to suppress insurrections, domestic violence, and so forth. Well, I don't think that's true. I mean, that's a problem of, what should they say, prudence. If you look at the Constitution, the only military or paramilitary group that is given the authority to execute the laws of the Union, which is what they're doing in these situations, or to suppress insurrections, is the militia. So we're talking about the National Guard in this context, right? There is an explicit authority to the armed forces to execute the laws of the country or to suppress insurrections. So one might say, well, maybe this statute has some constitutional problems, except when we go all the way back to the beginning of the country. The very first statutes of this kind allowed for the use of the armed forces, basically the Army at that time, all right? So those were people in Congress who had been in the Constitutional Convention, either in Philadelphia or in the various conventions in their states. They were the ones who wrote the Constitution. So I would be rather chary of saying, well, they didn't know what they were talking about when they put the armed forces, the Army, into these original statutes. Now, as a prudential matter, if I were the president, I would say, well, I don't want to bring in, unless it's absolutely necessary, I don't want to bring in anyone from the regular armed forces, because that does have a kind of bad look, extreme situation, right? this is not an invasion directly because we're dealing with people who are already in the country. We're not talking about the border. All right. I have enough in the National Guard, bolstered by the local police who will cooperate with us because they'll have to.
Will they?
Well, I would think they would. They probably have protocols for dealing with the National Guard. And they'd get an interesting situation if the governor or the mayor says no to the police. If I were the police commander, I would say no to the governor. I'm going to go along with this. I'm going to go along with the National Guard and the president. But that's another question, right?
That's a political question.
Yeah, political question.
Yeah.
Somebody thwarting the operation of dealing with these riotous situations. But if I were the president, I'd say, I'm not going to call in the Marines now. It hasn't gotten to the point where I need Marines or the 101st
Well, I
Airborne.
don't know how it is today or
No, not yet.
yesterday.
Well,
I don't
whatever.
know.
I don't need Marines now. I can bring in enough National Guard because I can bring in not only the National Guard from
California.
California.
From other locations.
Arizona, Nevada, Virginia. I can call in the National Guard all over the country because the statute says I can use the militia, period. Any militia. Call them in from everywhere.
Okay.
Right.
So
that's, I'm just thinking it's a prudential matter, sort of political, what do they say, political sight that we're presenting to the public. But the people who are saying that because he has called in the Marines, he is acting tyrannically, are using the word tyranny in a totally incorrect sense.
that's what I'm trying to get to. So the better understanding of what the word is and means and this particular action and activity.
Tyrants always act in violation of the law. You can't say someone who is tyrannical if he's acting in conformity with the law, unless you were to say a statute is unconstitutional, there's a higher law that this man is actually violating. And I don't think anyone, because most people don't even talk about this statute, I don't think anyone is saying this statute is unconstitutional. I've never heard anyone say that. They talk about the Insurrection Act, or they don't like it being used, but read the statute. It gives them the power to do this. If you want to go to the Supreme Court of the United States and say it's unconstitutional, well, then you're going to go back all the way to 1827. Right? I mean, there's a long history of this.
When Governor Newsom went into, I guess, emergency court procedure, he went in to do what?
He went in to restrain the president from whatever, using the Marines, using the National Guard, declaring. These statutes require, and I haven't seen that, but the statutes require the president to come up with a proclamation. Let me just try and find it. Title 10, Section 254, proclamation to disperse. Whenever the president considers it necessary to use the militia or the armed forces, he shall by proclamation immediately order the insurgents to disperse and retire peacefully to their abodes within a limited time. And that's typical of what a governor would do in a state, right?
Right.
Riots going on, the police get out with the bullhorns. There's a proclamation, you must leave the property.
I think also Karen Bass, the mayor, I think it was last night or the night before, called a curfew.
Well, that's the mayor. The mayors have that kind of power.
Yeah.
We're talking lower level. But this particular statute talks about the president. The president's using his authority to call the organized militia, the National Guard, or the armed forces, the Marines, and according to the whole sequence of statutes, he is supposed to issue a proclamation, or maybe you do it by executive
Does that
order.
mean a statement? When you say
Yeah, I mean
proclamation,
a statement.
like,
I have
okay.
determined that there are these domestic disturbances which can't be handled by the state authorities, and therefore I am calling upon the National Guard, and I am calling upon anyone who is engaged in these activities to cease, desist, and disperse to their homes, all be subject to arrests and prosecution, whatever. That's the way it would be written. Now, I haven't heard that he's done that. I would imagine he probably has. That's a pro forma thing that they do. But if I were the president, going back to your initial point, I would probably not be calling up the Marines. They happen to be in Camp Pendleton, which is close. They're available. Probably a lot easier than bringing National Guard people from Texas or Kansas, wherever. And so it was somebody in his entourage, the president's entourage, says, oh, see, we have these forces over here. Why don't we use those? And if I had been the president, I said, well, that's a bad look politically. Mm-hmm. We don't need that. It hasn't gotten to the extreme that we need to send in the Marines. We'll just deal with the National Guard. And maybe we'll call up some of these unorganized militia people to do some of the logistic things that are necessary to support the Guard. And we'll leave it at that. And that's clearly my authority. I'm the president now. It's clearly my authority under the statute to do that. And we clearly have the events that are going on that justify it. Oh, and by the way, once I've determined that those events are occurring, no one can question my exercise of authority. Martin versus Mott. I can tell you the Supreme Court's already ruled on this. End of discussion.
Okay.
But I'm not the president. But I'm not the president, right? They have that problem.
You and I discussed the possible arrest of state officials. We talked about that this may need to be called upon, but this is a very precarious thing if it were called upon, if it were done. What do you have to say about it, and could you share your initial constitutional thoughts about it? When is it justified?
Well, it's been justified for a long time. I mean, initially, if state officials are somehow interfering with the president's exercise of authority under the statute we've been discussing,
Yes.
that's a problem right there, interference with federal law, obstruction. If the state officials are behind in some way the riotous behavior, we talked about the people with the bricks or whatever, and somehow they're engaged in that, that's even more serious. But let's just go back to this concept of sanctuary cities.
Okay. Because I know you said to me that you said sanctuaries are a violation of the laws. They're unconstitutional.
Well, they're both, because the only authority under the U.S. Constitution with respect to immigration, naturalization, and so forth, who was a legal immigrant or who was an illegal immigrant, is Congress. That's not going to be determined by state legislatures, state governors, or even individual members of Congress. It's Congress as a whole has the power to pass laws one way or the other. Now, Congress has. We have a whole slew of laws dealing with naturalization, immigration, legal and illegal. And they are found primarily in Title VIII of the United States Code. And there's a section that applies to what's going on now, Section 1324, subsection A1. And it says that any person who, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that an alien has come to, entered, or remains in the United States in violation of law, conceals, harbors, or shields from detection, or attempts to conceal, harbor, or shield from detection such alien in any place, including any building or means of transportation, or encourages or induces an alien to come into, enter, or reside in the United States, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that such coming to, entry, or residence is or will be in violation of law, or engages in any conspiracy to commit any of the preceding acts, or aids or abets the commission of any of the preceding acts, shall be punished as provided in subsections. And the lowest level of punishment there is 5 years in prison. It goes up. I mean, some of them are 20 years. Some of them, they can be fined under the title or imprisoned for any term of years or for life if death has resulted from these events. I mean, it gets serious. Now, there is no exception in this statute for state officials or local officials, for governors, for mayors, for city council members. Anyone who engages...
Or police.
Or police, right? Anyone who engages in this activity that I just read, and it's pretty broad, could be prosecuted under this statute, and at a minimum, depending on the level of the malfeasance, 5 years in federal prison. So this whole concept of sanctuaries, where they are bringing in, where the officials are bringing in and encouraging people whom they know, or people whose illegality they are in reckless disregard of, because the statute talks about reckless disregard, right? They're subject to the statute. Now, if I were the President of the United States, I would have been calling on my Attorney General and said, let's find a few of these people, the most egregious ones, and let's prosecute them and see what the courts are going to say about this. And I think the courts are going to say, well, here it is. There's a statute that prevents this from happening. You don't get immunity. There is no such thing as immunity from criminal statutes.
Explain that.
Well,
it seems self-evident.
Well, in civil law, you take the police. They have a thing called qualified immunity. I don't agree with that. The Supreme Court and other courts have upheld it, which says, well, if they really didn't know that what they were doing was a violation of the Constitution, then at least the first time they do it, they can't be sued. If they do it a second time, then they can't be sued because then they would know, right? But in criminal law, if you violate a criminal statute with intent, what they call malice, right? Intentional violation, knowing violation of a statute, you have no immunity. You can't say, well, I'm a mayor and therefore I can violate a federal law, or I'm a governor and I can violate a federal law. Absolutely not.
Well, doesn't the state have jurisdiction over how they want to run it? The governor, the mayors, the whole bit.
No.
Well,
no.
Here's my question. Let me restate. Does the state government have a priority or like a primary right over anything with federal immigration? Remember, we have the separation of state and federal.
He has no authority. He has no. There's a case that only a few years ago, Arizona versus the United States, where Arizona passed some statutes which were an attempt to enhance under state law the provisions of federal immigration law, so that it would give Arizona a little more authority to deal with influx of illegal aliens. When the Supreme Court said, I think correctly, the way that statute was written, no, because Congress has the exclusive authority. There is no naturalization authority for the states. And the Supremacy Clause of the United States Constitution, Article 6, Clause 2, says that the laws passed by Congress are supreme over the laws of the states, and the judges in the states have to accept that supremacy. There's nothing the judges in the states can do about it. So who has authority over immigration law? Congress, under Article 1, Section 8. Do the states have any such authority? No. And everyone in the states, state legislatures, state governors, state judges, under the Supremacy Clause. So here we have a provision that talks about criminal violations of the immigration laws. Title 8, Section 1324, subsection A, talks about particular criminal violations. And it has no exception for state officials. Now, I guess Congress could write a statute that would have an exception, say, well, if a state official does it, it's all right. But Congress has not written an exception into this law. It says any person who does any one of these things is facing up to a minimum of 5 years in prison.
It does look like, when you listen to the leadership in California, my former home state, who I miss a lot, it looks like from the narrative that they do have the right. They talk as if they have the right. They're going to let anybody in, and they're welcoming everybody and anybody, whether they're almost kind of, in the language, dismissing the fact that they're not here legally. They're immigrants, and immigrants are immigrants. This is kind of the conversation that's being had. So there's a kind of dismissal of that they're not here legally. That's the rub. That's where the conflict is. And so I think people look to leaders, whoever they are, in power, as the example. And so if the leaders are aligned that people that have come in and they're not legally here in the country, and you're getting a pass, a green light from your government, it's confusing to the populations who haven't read the Constitution, don't know. We've never, you weren't even taught the Constitution in law school.
Well, we had a Constitution class.
We had a class,
Right,
but most people had never read it, and neither
Right.
did right?
That's right. We read so-called case law, decisions of the courts.
Right, but not the actual
Yeah, we didn't go through the
Constitution.
Constitution section by section and study it that way, no.
And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to hear Dr. Edwin Vieira, we did a piece called Calling in the Constitution that was filmed in West Virginia in 2020. And it was suppressed, and it was kept off of Twitter before Elon Musk bought it. It was suppressed on YouTube, and I didn't know of other platforms at the time, but it's available on its rainmakingtime.com or .ch, and we invite you to see it. It's a video.
Yeah.
It's a 2-hour special. And we filmed for 4 hours, and it was edited down to 2. It took months. And so with respect to the immigration matter, if there's approximately 20 million new people here that have not been vetted and that are not legally here, Now what? What does the government have the authority to do, the president and the administration have the authority to do about this? Because it's already happened.
Okay, well, let's go back to the states for 1 minute. The point that you made earlier, that they treat the state officials we're talking about, treat these people, well, they're just immigrants and so forth and so on. We welcome new people into the country. There's a distinction between legal entry and illegal entry. And we have to keep our minds focused on the illegal aspect of this.
Understood.
We're not talking about people who have gone through the necessary steps under the immigration laws. We're talking about people who are here illegally. Their very first step, and I mean that physically as well as legally, was to violate the laws of this country when they crossed the border. And they've been in violation of the country laws ever since. All right? And that's the burden of this concept of the sanctuary city, as I understand it. The people promoting sanctuary cities or towns or counties or states are saying, we are welcoming, in some sense, the illegal immigrant. We're giving you sanctuary because we don't have to worry about the legal immigrant. They don't need sanctuary. They're here legally. Nothing is going to happen to them. We're giving sanctuary to the illegals, which goes to this very point in the statute, knowing or in reckless disregard of the fact that an illegal has come to, entered, or remains in the United States in violation of law. The very concept of a sanctuary city is built upon the recognition of the people creating it, that the people they're trying to protect are here illegally. So they are, the sanctuary cities people or whatever, they are in clear violation of the statute. They ought to know that they are.
So I guess so now, wrapping that, what you just articulated up, are sanctuary cities unconstitutional? By their very design and nature.
Yeah, they're unconstitutional in two senses. First, they violate the clear statutory language of Congress. And secondly, they attempt to thwart or, what shall I say, emasculate, destroy the ability of Congress to control naturalization. They're saying, well, Congress may have passed this statute pursuant to its constitutional authority, and we are going to thwart that. In other words, we're thwarting the Constitution of the United States directly by thwarting the will of Congress through the exercise of its constitutional authority. And that's, in a sense, that's an insurrectionary event without the violence, right?
So why are they still standing? Why aren't they disbanded? Why do they have any authority? Why do they have any standing? That's the question.
Well, it's the question of the superior authorities. I mean, during the Biden administration, they certainly were not interested in any way in thwarting illegal immigration, let alone punishing people who were engaged in these sanctuary events or sanctuary activities. And now we have the Trump administration. Well, they're going after apparently the illegal aliens themselves or some of them. But what are they doing with the people who have been creating these?
That's my question.
Well,
yeah, that's my other question.
You have to ask Attorney General Blondie. Isn't she the chief law enforcement officer?
You call her Blondie. Blondie.
You can ask her, or you can ask the president, because under Article 2, Section 3, he has the constitutional duty to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Here's a law, right? I mean, this is as plain as day. Title 8 of the United States Code, Section 1324, subsection A, which is being violated left, right, and center in this country, has been for years. He's supposed to take care that the laws be faithfully executed. Why isn't he executing this law? Now, he wouldn't do it himself. I mean, if I were the president, I might do it myself. I might take it to the grand jury myself. I'm a lawyer. But why isn't he instructing the Attorney General? Saying, Ms. Blondie, here's this section of the law. We know this is being violated. California, Colorado, I suppose Minneapolis, Minnesota, wherever these various sanctuary cities are, sanctuary towns, counties. Pick out the most egregious examples and prosecute some of these people. Otherwise, we're essentially spitting into the ocean to watch it rise. We're not accomplishing anything here when we have groups of people in public office, not simply private citizens, but people in public office who are openly thwarting the laws of the United States with respect to the constitutional authority of Congress, the exclusive constitutional authority of Congress.
Okay. Understood.
You can't run a democratic republic based on constitutional law when some segment of the officialdom of the country, the group of officials, simply say, we're not going to follow these laws. We're going to go off on our own, do whatever we please, even though it's clear that they have no authority to do so.
Ladies and gentlemen, are you hearing this? Let this in. Share this with everybody you know. This is really important, and it's important that we learn this. I think this is something that people have to listen to over and over and over. So we're talking about the official non-enforcement of immigration laws and the official, not just resistance of them, the opposition to them, and the empowerment of others to not I don't like the word comply, to not honor the constitutional mandate.
Right.
All right. Now, we have something called, let me bring that up, No Kings in America. It says here, I'm on the website. In America, we don't do kings. They've defied our courts, deported Americans, disappeared people off the streets, attacked our civil rights, and slashed our services. The corruption has gone too far. No thrones, no crowns, no kings. June 14th, we rise up. Then there's a place to host an event and to host a toolkit. Find an event near you. And then they do a special note on Washington, D.C. with a big map, incoming calls, and trainings about this event. My understanding is, and this is at nokings.org, my understanding is that some type of, I don't know if it's law enforcement or National Guard, is being activated by the President of the United States in the different areas regarding this. What do you think about that? What would you do if you were president? We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Dr. Edwin Vieira. It's Rainmaking Time has produced over 530 segments with best-selling authors, heads of industry, creative mavericks, pioneers, visionaries, inventors, scientists, artists of all kinds. And this is a time where so many people are requesting payment, licensing, subscriptions. It's Rainmaking Time has not been doing that. We're asking those of you who appreciate It's Rainmaking Time and the body of work that we do to contribute, to donate, and to be involved without having to be asked for a membership. Some of the information that needs to be communicated in the world is so important, but now everybody who can speak on a microphone is competing online in the digital space. The algorithms that are set about you and what you're doing decide how much circulation you're getting. It doesn't matter what platform that you're on. If you cover a body of information that the algorithms are designed not to circulate, your work will not be circulated. End of story. So we are in a battle about algorithms and how AI is being set. Make no mistake. We really appreciate your support. We need your support. And we're going to be doing a crowdfunding to raise money for It's Rainmaking Time so we can have a more robust involvement of production people, people in the area of sound, in editing, in animation as needed, in graphics to help expand the show. And we are looking to set up the Rainmaking Network once and for all. Thank you very much. This is Kim Greenhouse, and back to the show. What would you do if you were president?
Well, that's, prudential prevision. If you recognize that you believe that some people are planning to engage in demonstrations which may become protests, which may become riots or domestic violence, and you have sufficient what's called intelligence of this, right, from your sources, then it would be imprudent not to prepare in some way, at least to have National Guard or police or whatever you thought was necessary on call in case the situation arose, because once the situation arises, it may be a little difficult to get the necessary forces in place to deal with it. So I don't see anything that's peculiar about that in particular, especially given what's going on already. Right, see what's going on already. People are organizing for protests in other places. It may very well be that the same kind of agitators will be involved in those protests and demonstrations leading to violent activity, unlawful violent activity in the Brandenburg versus Ohio sense. Why wouldn't prudent authorities?
No, I'm just
executive
asking you.
Well, I'm just saying,
I
why
don't
wouldn't
have an
prudent
issue with it,
authorities?
but-
In fact, you would say that whoever it was, governor, mayor, or president of the United States, was being highly imprudent and irresponsible, not preparing for it. That doesn't mean he's going to act necessarily in an unconstitutional or illegal manner. I mean, he has to stay within the parameters of his authority, but he should be exercising that authority in a kind of preemptive, predictive fashion, just in case.
And who are the people? Obviously, the governors all around America know that this event's going to take place, and who knows how long or how organized it is. If you were president, what would you administer if the funding of this does turn violent? And, you can't control everybody. Things really can happen in a heated situation. What would you do? Or what would you suggest he do?
Well, number one, I would show a certain amount of, what shall we say, political respect to the governors, and I'd contact them. I'd put out a letter and saying, we have information here in Washington that there are these demonstrations or protest activities. They're in some way scheduled to occur in your state or in the particular cities. And if this gets out of hand, we are ready from Washington to provide whatever assistance we can. If you want to contact, we've got some kind of a group here. If you want to contact some kind of a group to prepare for this in some way so that we can cooperate, we're ready to do that. If you fail to act, then we are ready from Washington, D.C. to invoke Section 253 of Title 10. We will act. So this is not something where you can simply wash your hands. I wouldn't put it quite that bluntly, but you know what I mean. I'm trying to do this politely. If for some reason you can't act or you fail to act, then we're ready to come in and deal with it, because we're not going to allow that to happen anywhere in the country where we can prevent it or stop it. And then at some stage before this happens, I would do, a national press conference. Maybe not press conference. I'm not going to have people asking me questions. I'm going to be there, and from the Oval Office, I'm going to address the nation. And I'm going to say, this is what we see happening under our Constitution. If it's engaged in a peaceful and appropriate manner, we applaud that, because we're in favor of
The First Amendment.
dissent in the First Amendment, and we want to have as many voices as possible in our political system. However, if this is planned to go beyond those limits, or it does in fact go beyond those limits, for whatever reason, we are also prepared here in Washington, D.C., through the National Guard and other agencies, to deal with it in an appropriate manner. End of discussion.
Many years ago, I have a teacher named Thich Nhat Hanh. He's a Zen Buddhist, and he was a wonderful teacher, left behind beautiful teachings. And he actually taught people about bringing in peace, about engaged Buddhism, about meditation, about being present, about mindfulness. He's kind of like the person who really popularized mindfulness, just the word, the essence of it. And he had led many walks and demonstrations totally quiet. Like he would announce, we're doing not a protest, but a walk, a demonstration about peace, or even if it was anti-war or whatever it was. And I took part in one of those walks in Los Angeles, I think it was MacArthur Park. Mm-hmm. It was so beautiful that people just walked where they were aligned in their heart, in principle, and showed up. And he led it. It was totally quiet. No yelling, no placards, peaceful. And so I've had the direct experience of the power of a peaceful protest that's actually just the presence of showing up in opposition or disagreement with something or for something. So much power. And if you would have told me before I actually walked with Thich Nhat Hanh and the group and the whole, like all these hundreds, there was at least 500 people there, I would have said it sounds interesting, but I wouldn't have believed in the power of it. It was profound. And I want to thank Thich Nhat Hanh and Sister Chan Kong and all the people that are part of Plum Village and his teachings, because that demonstration really was transformative about how you could make such a profound statement without yelling and screaming and, degrading things and, discoloring and having any kind of negativity or violence, to just show up that way.
Yeah. Well, that's what I would call moral and intellectual persuasion.
That was
done by that
profound.
kind
Oh
of
my
a
God.
demonstration, right? And that's the highest level, perhaps, of intellectual engagement with these kinds of problems. But what we're dealing with in this country now are groups of people fairly well organized and fairly well funded, and fairly well organized in the context of the country as a whole, who have a different goal ultimately. They want to use illegal immigration as some kind of battering ram against our entire system of government. And they want to use the illegal immigrants as a kind of cannon fodder, in a sense, in support of this. And of course, they all hate Donald Trump for various reasons. They have all sorts of political animosity towards him. And so it's natural that they want to escalate as much as possible the level of conflict and perhaps violence, and I would say probably violence, because that's the way they speak mostly in the final analysis. Not only violent rhetoric, but violent action based upon the rhetoric. And so they want that all to go on to undermine the ability of his administration, primarily, I would think, to do almost anything in this country that runs contrary to the, what I would call the neo-leftist narrative, right? Socialist, communist narrative.
And many, many times when we've spoken, and I think it's fascinating that most of us, and I'm not the militia age, but most of us don't know what a Bolshevik is. We are not in touch with our own history and the history of the world and how fascism and real tyranny has happened. Can you share with the public your translation of Bolshevism and a little bit about the past, the history?
Well, the term Bolshevism goes back to the Leninist Communist Party and the fight between the communists, which were Lenin's group, and the Mensheviks within the Social Democratic movement. And apparently there was a vote on one particular issue, and Lenin's people obtained the majority, Bolshoi. They became the Bolsheviks, and the others became the Mensheviks, the minority. And it wasn't something that was all-embracing. It was one particular issue of a relatively narrow sense. But in any event, Lenin then used this terminology to essentially prop up his movement propagandistically. We're the Bolsheviks, we're the majority, democracy is based upon majority, et cetera, et cetera. Now, he believed in democracy, I suppose, as much as Hitler did. Right. They were very similar in terms of being really tyrannical figures.
And when you say he believed in democracy, you mean mob rule?
No, democracy in sort of the good sense of calm people voting for something and the majority prevails, right? No, democracy to him was controlled by the party, which was a minority group. And in fact, he recognized that the party was going to be an illegal conspiratorial organization. He wrote a small book called What Is to Be Done. And he said it's not enough to wait for the wage earners, the proletariat, to rise up. They need to be led, because they're really not, I don't think he put it quite this way, but this is what he meant. They're really not smart enough. It's we, the intellectuals, the Trotskys, the Lenins, the Kamenevs, the Bukharins, we're the ones who really understand. The workers don't. We have to set up an organization composed of what he called the vanguard of the proletariat, the people who would lead the working class. And that's Lenin and his friends, including Stalin at the time. Let's remember that. Stalin was right in there with Lenin at the time. They were buddies in the initial communist inner circle. And it was to be a conspiratorial organization, and it was to engage in illegal activity, because what they were planning was the overthrow of the Tsar, of the Russian legitimate government. So this was Bolshevism. It's the organization of this vanguard group who consider themselves politically the enlightened people, and they are going to essentially impose their will. Oh, they have good motives, right? They're always interested in the welfare of the masses. They have good motives. We're going to impose our will. We're going to overthrow the established government, and we're going to do that ultimately by force and violence, which is what Lenin did, which led to a vastly destructive civil war in Russia. And then we're going to collectivize all of industry and so forth and regiment people, etc. And the next thing you know, you have Stalin and death camps and labor camps and all the rest of that business, which some people are familiar with. And Stalin was simply the natural outgrowth of Lenin. There was really no difference between the two of them, not one anyone says. So we have that now, with people using the Bolshevik tactics, which are ideological and physical undermining, rioting, for instance, of the established government. Criticizing everything. Everything is bad in this society. Everything has to be torn down. We need to have an entirely new system set up in which we, the intellectual group, the vanguard, will decide the structure. Okay. And that's what's organized, I think, to a large extent in many of these protest groups. They have essentially that kind of organization going on. I saw this in the Vietnam War at Harvard. All sorts of Maoist groups, Stalinist-type groups came in, trying to organize students against the Vietnam War, primarily because they were in favor of the communists, not because they were necessarily in favor of the war being improper or whatever, all sorts of reasons that one could have opposed that. But there was that organization going on. It was interesting to see how they were like a spider web throughout the student body. And this was in the 1960s. All right, the early 1960s, they were already there. So we have that kind of organization throughout the country. And I call it the Bolshevization because it really does follow the basic pattern of Leninist thinking and organization. And most people don't even have a sense that that's going on.
Well, most of us never learned it in history. And obviously it wasn't emphasized. If for those of us that did learn it, it wasn't emphasized to the point of being startling and important and something that we should remember our whole lives as a critical juncture in history.
Well, they don't want you educated in that because that's what they're doing. Well, if you're educated about it, you see what's happening. And you might very well disagree with what's happening. I mean, I can't imagine very many people who want to have a really socialized type of government in this country. You have enough problems with the amount of government regulation we have now. You want them regulating all of industry, all of social. I mean, you think about the way the Soviet Union, or think of the way Communist China operates today.
Oh, it's frightening.
When Americans want to live under the communist system, the social credit system, right? Now, impossible. But that's what eventually will happen if you put in one of these Bolshevik-type operations, Bolshevik regimes. And I just look at the rioting and the organization of that, and it just reminds me of the fact that the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, because they were all together in the same social democratic group initially, they had their agitators everywhere. The Russian army fell apart in 1917, largely through, of course, they had been defeated and suffered tremendous casualties and so forth and so on, the war. But there was political agitation in the Russian army, and the Russian army simply fell apart as a result of that. Well, who were those agitators? Well, they were Mensheviks and Bolsheviks, these socialist agitators, and they destroyed the Russian army, leading to the downfall of the Tsar system. Whether you think the Tsar system should have been, removed or not, that was the reason it fell apart. And the anti-Bolsheviks, the people around Kerensky and what was called the Cadet Party in Russia, which was kind of a democratic, in our sense of democracy, democratic party, they were basically a bunch of weak individuals, politically and personally. We call them today rhinos. Republicans in name only, right? They never really obstruct the Democratic Party, and eventually they go along and make some dirty compromise. But they couldn't, in the final crisis, they didn't have the personalities or the political skills or the organization to stand up to the Bolsheviks. And the Bolsheviks gained control of the government. And then there was a civil war. That was the next step, because there were large numbers of Russians who were not going to go along with this. And you had the whites versus the reds. Hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people, if you include the ones who died of starvation and so forth and so on, were killed. Lenin set up his government. He died shortly thereafter. Stalin comes to the fore, and the worst tyranny, well, not the second worst tyranny the world's ever seen. First tyranny, I think, is the Maoist tyranny. That was worse. But the second worst tyranny the world's ever seen is set up under this system. And then we have the Maoist tyranny, which is a reflection of that. And now they've become very sophisticated in communist China. So they seem to have a less violent character characters of their regime, but they control people through algorithms.
Oh my God.
Right, okay. They control them through computers. And you can imagine that. You can
And
imagine
surveillance, huge,
the surveillance,
massive
total surveillance system,
Yeah.
total control system.
We're not that far from that.
And really, in Lenin's mind, that's what he wanted to set up. And Stalin tried to set it up, but was on file cards, if you know what I mean, right? It all had to be written down.
In a Rolodex?
Right, well, that's the way they ran it, right? They didn't have computers. So it was all written in records of one kind or another, right? Filing card. And it would have Stalin's notation. These people to be executed, and there would be a check mark in red or something. He looked at this kind of stuff. But today, with the computerized systems we have, this would be the absolute perfection of the Leninist, Stalinist, Maoist system. They could actually make it work. Now, it would be terrible for the people who were, under its control. But for the vanguard of the proletariat, that leadership group, that would be fine for them. And that's all they really care about. If you look at all of these systems in the final analysis, the only people they care about are themselves and the lackeys who are supporting them.
All right, I have a question. I want a distinction made because I think also millions of people don't know the distinction between socialism and communism. This is a confusing demarcation. There are words that are used, but we don't understand the distinction. And I say myself too.
Communism is a pie-in-the-sky vision. Capitalism, you have the capitalists who own the factories. Let's put it on the simple-minded scale. They own the factories and they hire the proletarians or the employees. And because they control the capital which provides the jobs, they are capable of dictating wages and other conditions for the working class. And so the working class is always kept down economically. And the capitalist class, because they have the money, they elect the politicians, and so the politicians are working always in their interest. And therefore, it is somehow in the interest of the proletariat to conduct a violent revolution to overthrow the capitalist class and overthrow the capitalist government and set up a socialist government. Now, Marx predicted this would simply happen as an evolutionary stage in world history. This had the inevitability of a law of nature, was the way he put it. Lenin looked at it and said, no, that's not right. Because what we see is, through the political system, the workers are organizing themselves. They're electing candidates to public office. They're obtaining things like what we would call labor legislation, antitrust legislation, Social Security, and so forth and so on, right? Which are ameliorating their condition and, in fact, turning them into little bourgeois people. And we don't want that because they're losing their revolutionary ardor. And that's why we need the Communist Party. We need the vanguard of the proletariat because these workers are being corrupted by the system. They're becoming too wealthy, too well off, and they don't have the revolutionary fervor anymore. And we need to instill that into them. And they won't do it by themselves because they're basically too stupid. We're smart. They're not. We know what has to be done. Now, this is not really Marxism because Marx said it would happen automatically. Lenin said, no, it will not. He was a Narodnik.
What does that mean?
Well, they were the people the socialists and agitators who thought that if they went to the Russian peasants and organized the peasants would revolt. And the peasants said, no, we're only interested in having some land for ourselves. We're not interested in revolting, right? But the Narodniks believed that there had to be an actual organized revolt. It couldn't be simply a matter of historical evolution. All right, so this would then lead to government control, bureaucratic control of the means of production, all the factories. We're taking it away from the bourgeoisie because they're the bad people. We're eliminating them economically and then physically. We're taking over the factories and setting up socialist control by the bureaucratic class, all right? The NARCOMs, the People's Commissariat of Steel, the People's Commissariat of Water Transportation, the People's Commissariat of Heavy Industry, whatever. I think of Sergei Orjonikidze, one of Stalin's friends. He was the commissar of heavy industry, right? And each one of these bureaucratic agencies will be in charge of one of the economic parts of our society, overseen, of course, by the Communist Party, the Politburo, Stalin and his buddies, and the secret police, the NKVD, the OGPU, the Cheka, the OGPU, the NKVD, the MBD, the KGB. They changed their names over time. And they'll deal with anyone who objects to this system in a very direct manner. And Stalin also realized that, hey, he's got a lot of people who are objecting. Why should we keep them in jail cells at high expense? Let's send them out into the hinterland to work in the camps. And they can dig gold, or they can harvest wood, or whatever they were doing, right? A guy by the name of Neftali Frankel suggested this to Stalin. It's all in Solzhenitsyn's book, all right? Solzhenitsyn's works. He describes he was a zek, a prisoner in the labor camps. Okay.
What's the name of the book?
Oh gosh.
You know?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of it. I have a old person's blockage in my. I'll come up with.
We'll get back to it.
Yeah, Alexander Solzhenitsyn's book. Anyone's listening to this knows the book. I can't think of it offhand. But anyway, he goes into his own experiences in this. But socialism was to have this process of government control. What they didn't understand was that highly complicated economic systems of production depend upon prices. In order to produce steel, you have to know the price of iron ore, coal, when they were using that to smelt it, electricity or whatever, all of the inputs. Where do these prices come from? Rational prices, not made-up prices, but real prices. Well, they come from the workings of other part of the market. Coal mining, electricity production, so forth and so on. How many workers would be interested in working in a steel mill as opposed to working someplace else? You have to figure out what is a wage we have to pay these people or benefits we have to offer them to get them into the steel mill performing these functions. So very early on, intelligent economists said there's a problem called economic calculation. You can't know how to allocate resources effectively, efficiently, maybe fairly even, in a complex economy without a rational price structure. And the rational price structure depends upon having free markets in which there is competition for the use of resources. So the steel mills will see that there are other people trying to buy coal, and there's competition in steel mills, and the price of coal then fluctuates depending on this competition. Well, in the socialist system, there are no markets. Everything is decided by bureaucrats. And in separate agencies, these separate narcoms, people's commissariats under the Soviet system. So how do you have rational allocation? And the answer is, well, you don't. So how would a socialist system even begin to function? And the answer from the economists said, this is like 1920s and earlier. They said, well, the socialists would use prices in the free market. A socialist system in Russia would look to the prices in France or England, and they make guesses. And yes, there might be good guesses or bad guesses, but there would be tremendous waste. Right? Because the prices in France don't necessarily correspond to the reality in Russia. So there was a famous book written by a man named Ludwig von Mises, and the title of it was Socialism. And he said, here are all the problems with socialism, economic. They can't do it. It won't work. And they tried, and they failed. Stalin killed a lot of people and made a lot of people's lives terribly miserable to try and make the system work. Didn't work. And that's why the Soviet Union eventually collapsed. They couldn't maintain a high level of so-called defense production and all these other forms of production because they were a non-rational system. So it just failed. Had nothing to do with Star Wars, had nothing to do with Reagan, had to do with the inherent impossibility of socialism. Now, in the late 1930s or 1940s, along came the concept of computers. And the socialist economist says, well, we now have computers. They can figure out these prices for us because they can do millions and millions of calculations. And it's interesting, a kind of unknown author by the name of The Gulag Archipelago is the name of Solzhenitsyn's book, 3 volumes.
Say it again
Gulag
slowly.
Archipelago.
Gulag Archipelago?
Yeah, the Gulag was the name of the camps. Okay, the Gulag, the camp system.
By the way, just before you get to that, when I lived in Germany, even though I lived in Germany in 2015 and part of 16, I felt a distinct difference, not just, culturally, we would say, in the market, that the marketing competition was very small. It wasn't the same open possibilities as here in the United States. I noticed this in the markets, believe it or not, literally in what you could buy, products that you couldn't buy. It was very protective not to have too many products from outside the country. I've never seen that before.
Well, that's called interventionism. We can get to that in a moment.
Okay.
That's the kind of intermediate stage. So by the end of the 1930s, 1940s, computers, analog computers were coming along, mechanical computers, and the socialist economists were saying, well, now we have computers, we can solve this problem because the computers can do all of these calculations. We can get a rough idea of what the prices would be. It won't be perfect, but the computers can do it. And along came what I consider an obscure economist, Trigg v. J.V. Hoff, and he wrote a book called Economic Calculation in Social Society. Try and find that book today. You probably can. It's difficult.
Probably Google.
Well, it was in the stacks of Harvard Library. I found it. And he addressed this completely. He said, no, ultimately you're wrong, because if you're worried about the interests of the person down there at the bottom of the economic chain, there's no way you're going to know what his choices are at the time he makes them. The computers can't predict this. That's why we want to have now artificial intelligence to impose this on people.
Yeah.
Here are your limited choices. The computers can't predict this, and therefore your theory of computerized calculation will not work.
Well, I mean, like with, just as an example, with climate, the way they used the computers to then instruct the world about what the climate is and isn't was through simulations. In other words, it was, but it wasn't having to do with real data. It was all by simulation.
Well, that's the way you would predict choices of consumers. And when was the last time the weather was predicted accurately 3 days in advance? All right. If they can't predict it a week in advance, they can't predict it 20 years in advance. I don't even want to get into the climate.
Yeah, let's not even go
there. But here was the difficulty, and the socialist economists never got around that. And the only way you get around that is if you control the choices at the bottom of the chain. You don't give people the opportunity to make those choices for themselves. No, you can't buy a gasoline car. You have to have an electric car. Or no, you can't have an electric car. You have to use the electric bus.
But what makes the distinction? In other words, when does socialism really become communism? That's what I'm trying to understand.
Communism was a situation where the state, because under Stalin, the state controlled everything, right? You had a governmental bureaucracy controlling all of these narcoms, these people's commissariats, these bureaucratic entities. So there was this huge monolithic dictatorial apparatus. And according to Marx, the stages in development would be, there would be the revolt of the proletariat, and then you would have something called the dictatorship of the proletariat, in which there would be some kind of state apparatus controlled by the proletariat. Well, that didn't happen either. But then somehow, as the proletariat became more and more effective, the state apparatus would wither away. There would no longer be a government. There would be communism. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs or wants, depending on how you translate it, okay? Everything would be solved without state coercion.
Well, how is it organized?
Forget it. It's pie in the sky. It's utopia. It's nonsense. I mean, Lenin realized this, and Lenin was a Marxist. Stalin certainly realized it, and he was certainly a Leninist. All right? The communists in China have recognized it as well, and they do it by controlling the choices at the lowest level. They've said, oh, yes, we can do this in a vague way.
But we
control all the choices at the local level.
Card, and you need to have.
You whatever you need, and we don't care that you don't like this. All right, you'd rather live a different life as a Chinese citizen, but we control you. And the way we make the calculations, besides using prices coming from the outside world, is we dictate what choices you're allowed to make here as a Chinese citizen. And if you don't like it, well, maybe you can emigrate, maybe not. Maybe you can go to Laogai, which is their gulag, all right, their prison camps. So communism is pie in the sky. Communism is complete nonsense. I think Marxism is complete nonsense as well. Historical evolution is going to lead to this. That's no proof of that. And Lenin himself said, well, no, we can't go along with that. We have to have the Narodnik view of the vanguard of the proletariat, the illegal party. So even he wasn't a Marxist in that sense. Certainly Stalin wasn't. Stalin wasn't waiting for communism to come along. Right? He was going to be a dictator until he died, which is what happened. Right? So there'll never be communism, and socialism doesn't really work. What we have here and in, say, the Scandinavian countries or Denmark, and to a large extent in France, is what is really called interventionism. It's not where government owns industry, and we have bureaucratic dictation of how the industries are going to run. We have regulation. So the capitalists are still in existence. They own the factories, they own the airlines, whatever it is. The so-called proletarians, the employees, they're still in existence, and they're certainly not in control of the government, let's face that, right? They don't supply the millions and billions of dollars for election campaigns. But we have these huge bureaucracies that are set up to control through regulation. And whether you like the regulation or not, it's there. Sometimes it's good. We don't want pollution, for instance, from factories. We don't want unsafe products being hawked as if they were safe, right? You can think of all sorts of reasons why you would want so-called intervention in the free market, because the market is never really free. It depends upon property and contract, which are both legal concepts. And contracts can only go so far. You can't have a contract for murder. And property can only go so far. You can't sell defective products through fraud on the consumer, right? So in order to have that market function freely in the sense of the way things should work, there will be some level of regulation that's mandatory. Or at least let's say that most people would say is necessary or advisable. Now, the Scandinavian countries carry this, I would say, to a real extreme, to the point where they're actually getting into making choices for their own people, as opposed to simply preventing certain kinds of harms that shouldn't be allowed, period. This country is certainly going in that direction, faster and faster every year. You can't call it socialism. You can't call the Scandinavian countries socialist, because they don't own the factories. The government does not own most of the factories. They have not nationalized everything. And I'll give you an example from the United States that shows the dichotomy. During, I think it was the Korean War, Truman administration was having a problem with the steel industry. And I can't remember whether it was prices or allocation, whatever it was. And Truman issued a decree to take over the steel mills, temporarily to nationalize them, and says to put them under direct control of the executive department. Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company versus Sawyer. Went to the Supreme Court of the United States. Supreme Court of the United States said, no, absolutely not. You can't do that under this system, even temporarily. And I guess Truman was kind of hawking it as a war measure. I think it was connected to the Korean War.
It's my dad's birthday today, June 12th, and he was in the steel business.
Okay.
He worked for Gary's
then he would have known
Steel
about
Company.
this, because this was a cause célèbre all over the country.
Yeah.
All right. It was a big deal when the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. The President of the United States has no authority to do that. Now, let's take fascism, which is set up as the contrary to socialism.
Yeah, let's talk about fascism, because I think people collapse them all together as one thing.
Well, fascism has a number of socialist aspects to it, but basically it continued, and we're talking about Italian fascism. This is an economic
like a Mussolini
doctrine.
type
Mussolini,
thing?
all right? This is an actual economic doctrine. Mussolini started off as a socialist or a quasi-socialist, and he was very worried about this conflict between the capitalists and the wage earners. He wanted to find a way to mitigate or eliminate that conflict. So he was a reformer, not aiming to be, at least initially, to be a dictator type like Lenin. And he came up with this system called fascismo, Italian fascism, and it was based upon the concept of bringing the corporations, the businesses, and the labor people in labor unions into an organization that was supervised by the state. And they would actually have not only economic power deriving from the market, but they would have some kind of political authority. And through this system, they would be able to compromise and mitigate the conflicts between those segments of the economy. And this was called the corporative state, because the things that Mussolini set up were called in Italy the corporazione, the corporations. Not corporations in the sense that we're talking about, but these structures that had the business entities and the sindicati, the unions, together with the government standing on top, regulating this process. And he thought that that would eliminate the conflicts which were supporting the Marxist doctrine. So fascism was then a response, in a sense, to Marxism. Marx said these conflicts could never be resolved except by the overthrow of the system through the proletarian revolution. And Mussolini said, no, that's not true. We can create a regulatory structure in which we still have businesses, we still have workers, and the state will harmonize this in some way. And we're going to call these groups in each industry the corporazioni. So we had a corporazione for this and a corporazione for that, and so forth and so on. And one looks at this today and says, well, Mussolini, he was an opera buffa figure, a comic opera guy, dictator, right? Led an ineffective army, was defeated, blah, blah, blah. Okay, all these things about Mussolini. He was a bombastic figure. Okay. But his idea was not based upon, what shall I say?
It wasn't frivolous.
It wasn't frivolous.
It wasn't vanilla.
It wasn't frivolous. There were a whole school of economists in Europe at that time who promoted, or at least thought it was a good idea, to have this kind of corporative structure as the antidote to Marxism. You had corporativism in Austria, corporativism in Portugal. There was some corporativism in France. In Germany, they were called the Guild. In England, they were called the Guild Socialists. I mean, this was all over Europe. Now, what's interesting about it, if you talk about, that was real fascism, in the correct sense of the word fascism. A lot of people use the word fascism now to talk about totalitarian governments that suppress free speech and so forth and so on. Well, the socialists did that too. That's what Lenin did. That's what Stalin did. That's what Mao did. Right? So there's no difference there. Fascism recognized the continuation of some form of market economy. Socialism said we're going to do away with the market economy.
So what was Hitler?
Hitler was National Socialism. All right.
See, I think Americans would refer to him as a fascist.
He wasn't a fascist. He was a national his party, the Nazi Party, was the National Socialist German Workers' Party. That was the name of the party.
Fascinating. So we're all really we don't
confused.
really understand.
We're
Yeah,
confused.
a lot of confusion here.
He worked through the German cartel structure, which had existed long before he showed up. But his ultimate goal, and that's why he had a lot of friction going on within his own government and within the society, eventually he wanted to take that all over. Eventually he wanted the Nazi Party to control industry in Germany. But the war caught up with him, and he had to work through Krupp and so forth and so on, these big German industrialists. But the interesting thing here is we had actual Italian fascism in this country in 1933. Under whom? Who was the president in 1933?
I don't know.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's elected in
That was
1932.
before I was born.
Well, nonetheless, a lot of history is before we were born.
know,
But you
it's
do
incredible.
you have to go
Right,
back
right.
before you were born. All right.
That's why I just did a piece on the Bible.
Okay. Well, that really is before
really
we were
was
born. No, absolutely. Roosevelt's elected in 32. The Depression is going on, right? Collapse of industry. At that time, Mussolini was in office, and he was running his corporative system, Italian fascism, and he was considered to be a real statesman. If you look back at the way people were talking about him, including Winston Churchill, they were praising him. They were saying, well, this is a good man for Italy. Now, they were wrong, and he made a lot of mistakes there. He sided with Hitler. That was his big mistake. Right? But at that time, he was not considered to be a buffoon or incompetent. So what happens in the United States? Roosevelt enacts the National Industrial Recovery Act of 1933, his first year in office. What does this do? It creates an Italian fascist-type system. Instead of corporazione, they called them the code authorities. So there was a code authority for steel. There was a code authority for coal.
Is that like UCC?
No.
Okay, the Uniform Commercial Code?
No, that's
a
dealing with
different-
individual and
Okay.
small business. These were organizations which, take the steel industry. All of the steel companies were put into the code authority. And they were given the ability, and if they failed to do it, they would be coerced all the way up to Roosevelt, to set prices and allocate production and essentially divide up within their own area of economic activity how much was going to be produced, by whom, at what price, what the wage rates were going to be, etc. And that statute had the precursor of what became the National Labor Relations Act, the Collective Bargaining Act that was later passed by Roosevelt a couple of years later. So it was all in there. So there was a code authority for steel, there was a code authority for coal, there was a code authority for every industry. And at the head of these code authorities was a man by the name of Hugh Johnson, General Hugh Johnson, in the National Recovery Administration, just like under Mussolini. And at the head of this, the top man was whom? Roosevelt himself. Roosevelt himself was given authority to deal with these problems.
Is this still in effect? Is this Recovery Act?
Well, I'll tell you what happened to it. And in a sense, it is. There was a code authority for poultry production, and they had a live poultry code in the state of New York to which all of the poultry dealers had to conform. And if you didn't conform, there were criminal penalties. So there was a company called ALA Schechter Poultry Corporation. And as I understand it, they were Shechtim. You know what those are?
No.
Those are the Jewish ritual poultry slaughterers.
Oh, are they like Orthodox or?
Well,
whatever you call it, kosher?
Well, yeah, there were these Jewish dietary laws, which applied in some cases. So I imagine if people came in and they wanted their chickens slaughtered according to the dietary laws, the Schechter company had Shechtim, which were Jewish people who knew how to do that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what they were in New York, right? And the poultry code said that you had to buy a certain number of chickens in a coop. It regulated all the way down to the number of chickens in a coop. And the poultry authority would enforce this through criminal sanctions if you didn't do it. The Schechter brothers were willing to evade that law. And if someone came along and said, I don't want to buy that chicken because it looks sick to me, I want another chicken, the Schechter brothers would accommodate him, apparently. There was, this was going on in violation of the law. Okay? And that's why this case was called the sick chicken case. Not to mention that the Blue Eagle was the symbol of the National Recovery Administration. So that was a sick chicken too, right? Well, a sick chicken case because it involved chickens. And a trivial thing, how many chickens could be sold in a coop, and could a customer refuse to take one because he didn't like the look of the chicken? All right, so they're convicted. It goes all the way to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the government argued, well, all we're doing is we're creating a regulation to let each of these industries regulate itself. They know the best things to do, and we're just giving them the opportunity to do it and making it enforceable. And the Supreme Court said, well, no, what you're actually doing is you're delegating legislative authority to these code authorities, people in code authorities, and you can't do that. That is, and I quote them exactly, that is unknown to our law, quote unquote, unknown to our law, absolutely unconstitutional, 9-0 decision. Roosevelt comes back within a year. He goes to Congress and says, look, the problems in the coal industry are really terrible. They're really terrible. And John L. Lewis, the head of the coal miners union, is threatening to strike, and that would be disastrous for my Reconstruction program, getting the economy going again. So I want you to pass a bill limited to the coal industry. And members in Congress said, wait a minute, this is the National Industrial Recovery Act limited to the coal industry. This is never going to fly. This is unconstitutional. And Roosevelt said specifically, I don't care whether it's unconstitutional, I want it passed. And they passed it. Goes to the Supreme Court, declared unconstitutional. Okay? So this country actually had real, honest-to-goodness Italian fascism under Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 and up to the decision in 1935 when it was declared unconstitutional in the Supreme Court. We had Italian fascism in this country for actually 3 years because the Coal Conservation Act came the year later. All right. Real honest-to-goodness Italian fascism. So if someone wants to complain about fascism, they have to complain about Franklin Roosevelt, not Donald Trump, in terms of real honest-to-goodness fascism. Now, where we still have fascism is the Federal Reserve Act. The Federal Reserve Act is, if you compared it to the National Industrial Recovery Act, it's the same thing. Here we have this recovery administration, it's called the Board of Governors. Here we have these 12 regional bank systems. Those are the corporazioni, or the code authorities. Now, they have only banks in them, but nonetheless, they function the same way. And there are 12 of them, different parts of the country, and they incorporate all of the member banks, which are the commercial banks or the state banks, sometimes credit unions also, because they expanded it since 1913, and they are subject to self-regulation in a large sense.
That's why they've said in Congress that, they don't have to answer certain questions, and they don't have to they don't have any, they're not obligated to answer anything or to do anything.
Well, that's what they say, but that isn't true.
Okay,
and
that's
even the
good to
National
know.
Industrial Recovery Act, they were obligated to answer. All right, that's how it gets into the courts.
Mm-hmm.
But if you look at the two of them, these two structures, and you say, what's the difference? The difference is the National Industrial Recovery Act covered all sorts of activities in the economic sphere, whereas the Federal Reserve Act covers only banking. Now, the interesting thing, of course, is that banking affects everything in the economy.
Of course, it's
All
like
right?
the central nervous system of everything.
Yeah, exactly. Much more so in the coal industry or the steel industry or whatever.
Much
it is
more
the key.
insidious.
All right. Now, why is the Federal Reserve Act still in existence? Well, because it was passed in 1913, not 1933.
But talk about, I interviewed G. Edward Griffin on the Federal Reserve, his book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, like 12 years ago. And that got passed, in the middle of the night in a lame duck Congress? Tell us.
At the end of the year? Well, there was enough people. They had a quorum. But it was lame duck in the sense that a lot of people had gone home for the Christmas holiday. And you have to understand the whole thing was planned by the bankers and their friends. If you go down to the Jekyll Island Club,
Which I hear is really nice.
well, it's run by Marriott. At least when I was down there, Marriott Hotels ran it, and they built a big addition to it. It was originally a small building still there, for duck hunters, millionaires. They go down and hunt and fish and whatever.
I mean, it's quack, quack, bang?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah, okay.
That's no good.
But they met in a particular room. A number of these people met, and they planned the Federal Reserve in that room. And if you go down there, at least when I went down there many years ago, in the last century, end of the last century, the Marriott Hotel people would show you this room. They had a plaque, and they had pictures of all but one of the conspirators there. And here was the table where they sat, and the buffet was over here, and so forth. And there was the dining room in the back of the building, and you could actually have dinner in the dining room in the building. And the fellows would take you through and give you a tour. They were very upright and honest. But this is where it happened. Federal Reserve was planned here. Okay, who was doing the planning? The big bankers and their friends in big industry. They passed the statute under Woodrow Wilson, the man who got us into World War I, despicable character. And it was supposed to do what? It was supposed to, through scientific management of banking and the creation of my banking and credit, it would eliminate depressions and it would eliminate big inflations, hyperinflations.
I do want to do a whole show with you.
You can do it.
So we'll do,
because this is where it ends.
Yeah.
20 years later, we had the worst depression the country had ever faced before. So apparently the Federal Reserve did not prevent depressions. And it's resulted in this huge level of debt. There's no way you could have $40 trillion in indebtedness of the federal government without having the Treasury interconnected with the banking system. Right? They're like Siamese twins, if I may use that expression, of the worst kind. Right? And this goes all the way back to Alexander Hamilton. Alexander Hamilton, being a big centralist, was way ahead of his time. And he said, we need to stabilize the government to have a close and permanent connection between the financial center and the private financial people who were then in New York and to a certain extent in Philadelphia. Okay? We need to have this so they can, when necessary, they can support the government through loans. We'll have taxes, but taxes may not be sufficient. We may not be raise them quickly enough. We can always turn to the financial people in the marketplace, the big financiers, the bankers primarily, and they will be there. And therefore, we have to give them the support of the government. We have to give them the support of kind of regulation that they want to see, so that there will be this symbiotic relationship between the two of us, between the government and Wall Street, if you will. All right? And that's what they've done ever since. Everything they have done in the government is to maintain this relationship, even when the financial system collapsed under Roosevelt, or prior to Roosevelt, when Roosevelt came in. What was the one thing he did? Well, he created the Securities and Exchange Commission to control what? fraudulent
investments.
manipulation of securities.
Well, do you think that that's the real total? I think it's something else too.
What?
I think it's that, but it's also to control the marketplace.
Oh, yeah, well, because the bankers control the marketplace
But I mean, the
by loaning.
SEC is to
Yeah.
overlord
Yeah.
the marketplace.
Oh, yeah.
So why is it, for example, that I can go into Vegas and blow $100,000 personally, but if I want to do a crowdfunding and raise, $100,000, I have to go through the SEC and do a certain filing? How come?
Well, because the SEC supposedly is protecting the consumers of the people who would
Yeah,
come.
but I can go and buy a car and get into $50,000. I can go buy a Tesla today, and go and get into massive amounts of debt.
Oh, debt they
That
don't care
can't
about.
be
No.
certain. Yeah,
They're
but
concerned with fraud.
no, they're concerned with fraud and investment.
Yeah, well, that's another thing.
Okay,
They're
that's a
concerned where the
whole
money
other-
goes.
That's a
That's
whole
right.
other
That's
domain. It's
that's another
controlling
story.
where it goes, how much it goes, its circulation, even what constitutes an investment,
Yeah.
and who's fit to invest based on
Right.
Reg A, D, this, that.
That's right.
Okay, Regulation C. So
I'm just saying it was sold on the basis of
Yeah.
they wanted to prevent these high flyers on Wall Street
yeah,
from engaging in fraudulent transactions. But they knew as well as anybody else that once you get into that regulation, once you open that door of regulation at all, now all these other aspects of investment are subject to scrutiny and control.
yes. All right, now I want to return to Harvard.
Harvard. Oh, yes, Harvard.
I want to return to Harvard because we went way out, but I'm so glad that you explained communism, socialism, fascism, how do you pronounce it?
Bolshevism.
Bolshevism, okay? And you gave us a tour down the history lane that most of us don't know or won't remember or didn't remember and were never taught. Where are you at constitutionally about the president revoking funding to Harvard?
Well, you see, there's the rub. When I was at Harvard, going way back, there were a lot of professors there who had come out of the Roosevelt era as young men, obviously, and now they were, getting on. And they were very much in favor of the type of regulations that started in the New Deal. Maybe some started under Wilson, but they primarily started in the New Deal, the regulatory authority. And one of the interesting cases of regulatory authority in the Roosevelt era was the case of Wickard versus Filburn. And this involved a farmer who had been given a wheat allocation because they were controlling agriculture and telling the farmers how much they could grow or not grow. And he grew more than his wheat allocation allowed him.
I remember you sharing.
So they
this.
went
This
after
is
him.
important.
And his defense was, wait a minute, I'm not selling this wheat on the open market. That's why there were wheat allocations, to control how much wheat goes into the market, because Roosevelt wanted to reduce supply in order to raise prices, get out of the Depression by raising prices. And so the farmer's saying, I'm not selling my wheat, so this can't apply to me. And the Supreme Court said, well, no, you're taking that wheat and you're feeding your cows with it. And if you didn't feed the cows with the wheat that you grew, you'd have to go in the market to buy feed for your cows, and therefore you're not using your wheat in the market. It's causing you to do something else in the market, and that's why we can regulate you, because you're still having an effect on the market.
Oh, my God. So everything is affected.
So everything is affected. This is the affective commerce theory, all right?
I remember
And
this.
some kind of argument was made along the lines of, well, wait a minute, just because this is a regulatory authority doesn't mean that they can regulate in this way. And the Supreme Court said, it is not a violation of due process to regulate what the government subsidizes. In other words, if the government's going to pay you money and you're going to take it, and it has regulatory strings attached to it, you cannot complain if you take the money.
Okay, so what I'm getting is this applies directly to Harvard.
Yeah.
Okay.
If they are receiving money from the federal government and it has regulatory strings that they can do this or they can't do that, or they're subject to this kind of scrutiny or what have you, then they can't complain. The only thing they can do is say, we're not taking the money anymore.
So
Because
why are they
they're not
suing?
entitled to the money in the first place.
Aren't they suing the presidential, the
Well,
administration?
yes, and I'd like, and
How
I'd
is
wonder,
that
I'd wonder
possible?
what the technicality is there, right? It may be that, well, he's not entitled to interpret the regulation this way, or he's required under this regulation to have some kind of notice and hearing. Right? There's a whole series of Supreme Court cases that say the government cannot take away some benefit that a person has been granted, such as welfare benefits, Goldberg versus Kelly, famous case, unless there's a procedure.
But this is institutional funding. This is not personal.
Well, it doesn't make any difference, whoever it is. The welfare happens to be an individual. But if you're talking about a government subsidy, and welfare is a government subsidy. You're talking about a government subsidy of some kind, and it's going to an institution. Listen, when I was at Harvard, Natural Sciences, Chemistry Department, we had all sorts of money coming from National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health, subsidize our equipment and so forth, and costs, which were substantial. And I think behind the scenes, a lot of that money was probably coming from the Defense Department, kind of washing it through the National Science Foundation. But what was that going to? Well, that was going to scientific research and the training of people. I was a chemist and a physicist, whatever we had there. And it had regulations. There were certain things you could do and certain things you couldn't do. No, I never got into a situation where I ever heard that Harvard was doing something it couldn't do or had some kind of problem, but it was well understood. And so if you wanted something done, we had to justify it. All right, fine, okay. And that's what these regulations are, whatever they are. But the question always arises, when the bureaucrats are dealing with the enforcement of the regulations, are they following the protocols within the regulations?
Are there? Are there protocols?
Oh, there always will be. The terms in which they can revoke.
Where is that located? If someone wanted to read about
it. First it would be in the Code of Federal Regulations. Right?
Is that changed every year?
Well, it changes when they want to change it.
Well,
I don't know. You follow that every year.
Where does one get the Code of Regulations?
It's printed, or it's online. Okay. Actually online. You want to dig through it, you can find the Code of Federal Regulations, which would apply to this, whatever these subsidies are.
And who at the White House would be looking at that?
Who's ever interested in doing harm to Harvard University for whatever reason?
They're not interested in doing harm. They're just interested in having their requirements or their terms and conditions enforced.
I would imagine there's reasonably regular oversight.
Okay.
And someone could complain, I suppose.
All right.
I suppose some students at Harvard, let's say this is a student subsidy and the subsidy is being given to foreign students primarily, and some citizen, non-foreign student at Harvard says, wait a minute, I can't get this. And under the regulations, I should be able to get this, but they're not giving it to me. I should be able to compete for this, whatever it might be. And he could complain. He would have standing to complain to some bureaucrat.
Where does Harvard go when they're launching this lawsuit? Is that a Supreme Court issue, or are they going to a law?
Oh, they'll go to the lowest level. Now, they might have to complain to the bureaucrats to begin with and file a formal complaint with the agency that's supplying with the money.
So would that be Treasury?
Well, it would be some subsidiary agency. Okay. Well, in the case I'm talking about, National Science Foundation, National Institutes of Health. Okay.
All right.
And they would have their own regulations as to what they were supposed to do. So if you had a complaint in our chemistry department with the way the National Science Foundation was funding our department, that's where the complaint would initially go, to the NSF, and say you're not providing us with the money that you're supposed to. All right. And then there'd be something go on there. There'd be procedure. If you didn't like that, there'd be an appeal procedure outside of the agency into the court system.
Okay.
So, but I just get back to Wickett versus Filburn. In a way, Harvard is responsible for this because the Harvard Law School and a lot of other people at the time were very much in favor of this concept. It is not a violation of due process for the government to regulate that which it subsidizes, right? And that's what they're looking at now, basically. There are subsidies coming to them, taxpayer money, and they're subject to some regulations, strings, as they say.
Yeah.
And apparently they don't like the way the strings are being pulled. Maybe they have a case, maybe they don't. But if they don't, they're really not in a position to complain because in the old days, and this is before I was at Harvard, going back in the late 30s, 1940s, it was the Harvards and the Yales and the Columbia law schools and so forth that you read the law journals of the time. These were the people that were in favor of all of this government regulation. This was the greatest thing that the country could do. Roosevelt was right or Truman was right, whatever. Do this. Okay, they did it. And now we have this precedent. And the Supreme Court, the amazing thing, the Supreme Court upheld this case, I think it was South Dakota versus United States. South Dakota was involved in some kind of regulatory scheme. I think money was involved, whatever. And South Dakota said, wait a minute. They can't require us to do this because they don't have the power to impose these regulations. Notwithstanding they're giving us the money, they don't have the power to impose these regulations. The Supreme Court said, you're wrong. When they give money, they can impose any regulation they want, even if it's a regulation that they could not impose directly under the Constitution.
That's fascinating. Say that again. Yeah. Say that again.
With these spending programs, if Congress imposes a regulation, a string, as they call them, that you have to follow as a recipient of the benefit, Congress can impose a regulation that they could not impose directly. So Congress could not pass a statute saying you're going to be subject to this regulation, period. But if Congress passes it, because that's unconstitutional for them to do it, but if Congress passes a subsidy statute and attaches to it this unconstitutional regulation, then that regulation is valid. And I always thought, looking at that, wait a minute, when they passed this subsidy legislation with this regulation, they were essentially bribing the state or someone else to allow Congress to engage in unconstitutional activity.
Which it does all the time.
Well, but I mean, that's what's going on. It's a bribe.
Sadly.
To engage in illegal activity. What is the second listed crime for impeachment in the Constitution?
I don't know.
I'll give you a hint. The first one is treason.
Right.
What's the second one?
Bribery.
Bribery.
Yeah.
Yeah. The Founding Fathers considered bribery to be just behind treason. And so they mentioned it because the others are other high crimes and misdemeanors. We don't know what they are. There's a list of those. You have to kind of invent those, come up with those separately. But they considered bribery to be so important that they put it right there next to treason. And so here's the Supreme Court that says, oh, yeah, Congress can engage in these bribery situations so that it can exercise powers that it doesn't have under the Constitution of the United States. Now, this is the Supreme Court of the United States. They couldn't figure this out. They couldn't simply look at it and say, wait a minute, the result of a decision in favor of Congress here will be to say that Congress can engage in the very activity that the Constitution claims is so bad that it's impeachable in order to gain powers that it cannot have under the Constitution. In other words, to usurp powers, or what's the word we talked about before? To engage in tyranny. It's collective tyranny. It's not one tyrant. It's a group of tyrants. It's 435 tyrants. Right? So you think about that. That's the Supreme Court of the United States said this. And I'll bet, let me not impugn Harvard, but I'll bet there were some of the leading law schools in the country that were in favor of that decision. The law professors. And now it's coming back to haunt them.
All right, so now stay with me. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are interested, by the way, I just want to let you know, and you want to have Dr. Edwin Vieira do a live feed with me, and it's Rainmaking time, let us know. We'll set it up and we'll do it. And you can have your questions addressed and concerns addressed. I want to go back to Harvard now.
Oh, yes.
And I want to take the situation where there was a Columbia student that, there was a whole judicial case about whether he could be deported or not. And where are you with regard to bringing in and deporting international students or immigrants?
Well, let's start with the immigration. Once again, we get back to the plenary of full, complete power of Congress over naturalization. And, of course, naturalization involves entry into the country. So Congress has the authority to include or exclude anyone it wants, period. Supreme Court's held that going back to whenever. And it's so bad, in fact, that Congress could exclude people based on race. They kept the Chinese out of this country. They kept the Japanese out of this country for a long period of time. They created quotas during the 1920s, people coming from different countries, people having to have certain economic status. If you came to this country, you had a job or you had a sponsor or whatever. There were all sorts of limitations.
That's true in my experience, having been in three and four different countries. that there is still that going on.
Yeah, well, it was going on in
You
this
had to
country.
have a certain status. You had to have a certain
and no one
amount of
ever questioned it.
capital.
No one ever
Right.
questioned it. Supreme Court never questioned it on the basis that Congress has this authority and that's it. No one has a right to come into this country. And it also involved things like the First Amendment. There was a famous case of I can't remember what his exact discipline was. He may have been an economist, maybe an historian, whatever. He came from one of the East European communist countries after the war, and he was invited here to give a lecture series. And he was apparently a high-level intellectual. And he was also a communist. And at that time, the Attorney General had a list of communist countries that didn't let people into the United States, and he was one of those countries. So they kept him out. They wouldn't give him the visa to come in to give this lecture series. And he sued, and a group of, I think mostly professors and others, sued on the basis that he had a right to speak and they had a right to hear him. There's the First Amendment. If I have a right to speak, you could say that you have a right to hear me. Otherwise, I'm speaking to the wind, right? That concept. The Supreme Court said, no. Bill of Rights has nothing to do with this. Congress has complete authority. They can keep him out for this reason or any reason. And they're keeping him out because he's a communist or he's coming from a communist government, has a position in the communist government. That's the end of it. At First Amendment, your rights under the First Amendment, even if they were applicable, and they were saying, well, maybe you don't have standing really under this because you're not the person coming in or going out. But even if you do, it doesn't apply. Okay, so that's the end of that. So as far as those people coming into the country, there has to be provision for it. They have to come in under the appropriate regulations. They have to abide by the regulations. If they don't, then they're subject to something.
So somebody comes in from any country outside the United States, and they're attending a university, and they're on, I guess it's a student visa. I'm not sure.
Yes, something of that nature.
Something like that. And they're speaking out against this country. And I hope I'm speaking about and referring to the right case, but the president wants them, or somebody wants them deported.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think about that?
Well, let's look at what would the regulation be. Right, they come in under these regulations subject to the regulations.
I have no idea.
No, I'm just saying. Yeah. I don't know the exact regulation that the Trump administration is using here, but just in principle. And so the regulation says when you come into this country, you are not allowed to engage in communist propaganda supporting the government of China. You're not allowed to belong to any pro-communist Chinese organizations.
Well, maybe there's no regulation.
Well, I'm just saying, just assume this, right? So we're dealing with a First Amendment question, right? You're not allowed to belong to these organizations. You're not allowed to give speeches about this. You're only coming into this country to study economics or physics or whatever it might be, right?
Well, that then smacks of a limited. If someone's here on a student visa, they have a limited First Amendment right. It sounds like, or no First Amendment.
Well, they have whatever rights Congress allows them to have. Here's this guy coming in for the lecture series. He had no rights that the Attorney General had to respect because Congress had a statute saying he had no rights to come into the country. So anyone who comes into the country has to live by the regulations. And I've never seen a case where the Supreme Court said, no, Congress cannot impose regulations of this kind, impose any kind of regulations.
If it's not Congress, I guess I want to go back to...
Well, wait, one second. Okay. So whatever Trump's administration is doing, they have to be saying that there's a regulatory prohibition on the activity of this individual, which then triggers a deportation process. Just as if he came into the country, he now engages in holding up 7-Elevens or dealing in drugs. Deportation. Now, there might be a process. He has to be arrested or he has to be investigated. What the immigration, naturalization people have to hold him, whatever it may be. But he engages in that improper behavior, and that triggers his deportation, period. So this is a question of, let's assume it's political and ideological. You can come in on a student visa for these purposes, sponsored by this university, but we're not going to allow you to engage in, well, let's take the Middle East. We're not going to allow you to engage in activity promoting the interests of Hamas, this international terrorist organization.
I know. Yeah,
okay?
Yeah.
So if you become a supporter of Hamas, you join a Hamas organization, you give lectures in support of Hamas, that might be sufficient under these regulations to cause you to be deported. I have no idea in the case of this particular individual what he
so let
did.
me ask you this. Let's dig deeper. Where does somebody go? Let's say I'm a student from coming outside the United States, and I want to study here, and I'm all excited. Where do I go to see the regulations? And is it state regulations or federal regulations?
Oh, it's entirely state. Well, at the level we're talking about, it's federal regulation.
Okay.
Immigration regulations. Well, the regulations will be written up for whatever type of visa you want. You're coming in for a student visa on this. You're coming in to be a full-time student, part-time student. You might be coming in to be a lecturer. Maybe you already have a degree.
So do you have, in this context, given the regulations, I want to go a little bit deeper in, whatever are the regulations federally about somebody coming from outside the country, going to school here, it sounds like, and I'm not saying it is, but it's feeling like they do have or might have a limited First Amendment right just by being here.
Well, yes.
In other words,
yes.
They're not citizens here.
Yeah.
They don't have the same rights as people who are citizens here.
Mm-hmm.
They have a transitional or temporary visa, right, to study. But it's, I can't, that would be an interesting thing to find out. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with Dr. Edwin Vieira. If you would like to see this segment of It's Rainmaking Time circulated, heavily distributed throughout the United States and the world, so that people really could get inside constitutional writing and understanding, we're going to crowdfund this. We want you to donate like there's no tomorrow. Tell your friends, your associates, people you know that care about the country, that really don't know the Constitution, but are very concerned about it and still feel that it should be applied and honored as a sacred document that was created for this country, for freedom and liberty, and to prevent the bypass and misuse of power and leadership. We need to raise at least $100,000 to move this all over, into every network, into every portal, into everyone that's interested. And the existing algorithms won't do it. They won't do it. This has to be sent by email, by text, by DM. Thank you. And back to the show. So do you have, in this context, given the regulations, I want to go a little bit deeper in, whatever are the regulations federally about somebody coming from outside the country, going to school here, it sounds like, and I'm not saying it is, but it's feeling like they do have or might have a limited First Amendment right just by being here.
Well, yes.
In other words,
yes.
They're not citizens here.
Yeah.
They don't have the same rights as people who are citizens here.
Mm-hmm.
They have a transitional or temporary visa, right, to study. But it's, I can't, that would be an interesting thing to find out.
Well, they're subject to whatever limitations the visa program has established, or Congress has established in the visa program. Right. And all I'm saying is, if you look at the history of immigration, the Supreme Court has upheld essentially anything Congress wants to do in terms of limitations.
Okay.
So if there is what we would call a First Amendment limitation here, certain things you cannot engage in. Well, we were talking about protest activities. Let's take that as an example, First Amendment activity. The student engages in some, pro-Hamas. Let's take that as an example because that's kind of a hot issue today. Pro-Hamas organization.
Let's say it's pro-Palestine. Let's take it away from the most obvious.
I'm just using what the media does, right? Because they've demonized that particular group, rightly or wrongly, okay? So they say anyone who speaks up for Hamas is a bad person, right? So let's just take that.
It's also noted that anybody that speaks up for Palestine is treated the same.
Take either one.
All right.
Either one you want to make the bet noir here.
It looks pretty incendiary either way. Go ahead.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Okay. I'm trying to use the most incendiary one to give Congress the benefit of the doubt. So Congress passes this immigration visa regulation that says you cannot engage in activity in favor of terrorist organizations. Organizations have been designated as terrorists by the Attorney General or whomever. And let's assume it is that Hamas is one of these organizations. It has some kind of terrorist label attached to it. So this student comes in knowing of that regulation, and he joins a pro-Hamas advocacy group. Or he engages as an organizer of a pro-Hamas demonstration, and he's out there cheering for Hamas, whatever their slogans. And somebody connected with the federal government notices this. They say, wait a minute, this guy's a foreign student. They look him up. Absolutely, he came on this kind of visa. The Attorney General somebody has determined Hamas falls into this category of bad groups. This fellow is advocating, he's taking these actions on behalf of that group. He's violated his visa regulation. Out.
Okay, I want to take this a little further.
You may not like it.
Yeah.
And he may not like it. And you may say, well, that's in violation of academic freedom or,
It's
free expression.
Conditional. I mean, it's
conditional.
Things I remember. Yeah, immigrating. I immigrated to Germany, and so there's always
it's worse in European countries, for heaven's sake. God knows how bad it is in European countries.
Now let's take somebody from outside the United States who has committed crimes inside the United States and is being picked up, put on a plane, and sent to El Salvador prisons that were set up. Where are you about that?
Well, number one, if he's committed crimes in the United States, he could have been put in the United States prison. That's number one. He wouldn't have to be sent to El Salvador. He's sent to El Salvador, I take it, they want to deport him.
Yes.
And not, in fact, punish him for the crimes he's committed in the United States.
What goes on in those prisons is pretty... that's
another
serious.
question.
Yeah.
That's another question, right?
Which question?
But let's not get into that one. Just whether they can do this at all.
We're looking at can they do this
even
at
if
all.
the prison is a place where they observe some modicum of decency. All right. I'm talking about Central American prisons. I understand, what you're talking about.
This is very well organized.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, Trump has gotten into all sorts of problems, and he's playing these kind of ad hoc. I won't call them games, but experiments of some kind. Can I do this? Can I send them to Gitmo? Can I this and then? I don't understand it. Because we're talking about the potential for putting all these people through quote unquote due process in the sense that the average individual thinks of that, some kind of a trial with a judge or a jury hearing all sorts of evidence. He doesn't want to do that.
He wants to just send them to a prison outside the country and not
send them to a prison here and hold them until they have a hearing.
Yep. Okay. So here's my question. Here's my question to you. And people are on different sides of things. Do they deserve due process if they really did commit crimes here?
Well, you get due process even if you commit crimes here.
Even if you're from outside.
Well, from whatever. If you commit a crime here, you're arrested, you're indicted,
right?
You're tried,
yes.
You're convicted,
yes.
You're sentenced, you go to jail, or maybe you're acquitted. I don't know, whichever way. But there's your due process. The problem here is a lot of these people, we're not talking about they're having committed crimes. Because they committed a crime, it doesn't matter whether they're legal or illegal, they can go to American prison.
Right.
No problem about that. The question then is, can they be deported from the American prison, even if they don't go to a Central American prison? Just get them out of the country. But we're talking about millions of people who the advocates for the illegal immigrants say, well, they have to have due process in the sense of this complicated hearing procedure where they can introduce evidence in front of at least a judge or maybe a jury. Heaven knows the average person's view of due process. He's thinking of a trial like Perry Mason.
And most people listening won't know who Perry Mason is.
Well, he's a television lawyer many years ago, and he always exposed the wrongdoer on the stand and made him confess and so forth and so on. But there was Perry and the judge and the other side and the jury. That's what people think of a due process, jury trial. If you want to hold jury trials on all these deportation cases, it would take hundreds of years. All right, so what are you going to do with them? In terms of deportation, well, they're going to have to come up with some kind of streamlined procedure, which they haven't, obviously. But I'll tell you, to be blunt with this, and I'm not advocating it, but I suppose if I were Abraham Lincoln, you know what Abraham Lincoln did in the Civil War, beginning of the Civil War? He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. He said that anyone who was engaged in rebellion, sedition, secession, right, what was going on,
Oh, that's really scary. The
could be
suspension.
arrested and held without bail, suspension of the writ of habeas corpus. He's just arrested, and that's it. He can't get out. And he did it. He arrested a number of people. Now, he made the mistake of using the military authorities to arrest them instead of the civil authorities. And I always thought he went too far with that. But the interesting thing was Congress came along a little later and they passed a ratification statute. So everything he did was within his power. And I think it probably was. Not the military part of it, but the suspension of the writ of habeas corpus probably was. And I would think that some legal experts would be talking in the back room with Trump about, well, we have a problem here that is beyond the judicial system as it now exists. We cannot try all of these people in what the man on the street considers to be due process, at least not within a reasonable amount of time.
It's impossible.
Impossible. So, and this is an invasion, let's face it, that's the way it's been run. And the writ of the habeas corpus can be suspended when there's an invasion or a rebellion, which is now going on with all of these attempts to suppress the ICE activities. So we have a rebellion directly related to illegal immigration, and then we have illegal immigration, which is itself an invasion. And those satisfy the requirements for suspension of the privilege of the writ of habeas corpus. Who decides that? Well, Lincoln did under the emergency situations at the time. And it would be interesting to see if Trump did this. And I'm not saying he's going to go around and, arrest and put into some kind of detention centers, millions of people. Do it to a dozen, because they'll challenge it. Right? Do it to a dozen who have sufficient visibility, so they will get some lawyer from the ACLU or some other, nonprofit NGO, pro-immigration, who will challenge it.
So the way you're talking about it, as far as the way I'm hearing it, is you suspend habeas corpus for only certain people?
For the illegal immigrants.
Is that an official thing that's
done?
Oh,
he would do it.
The way,
Lincoln did it in a proclamation. It's a proclamation. He said, I'm exercising this power, which Lincoln showed was something that the president could exercise in these types of situations, ratified later by Congress. And the interesting thing is, if Congress ratified it, they were saying that the President Lincoln actually had this authority when he did it.
Wow.
All right?
Okay.
That's what ratification means. If you're my agent and you go out and do something, you sell my car, and I ratify that, I'm saying, well, you really had the authority to do that, because if you didn't have the authority to do that, it's not ratification, I'm doing something else. So anyway, but there's an interesting question there, that the fact that Congress ratified it really meant that they were recognizing he had the power to do it under those circumstances. At least that argument can be made for it. So I would test this out. If I were Trump, I would say, listen, we have a big problem. Why don't we do what Lincoln did? Why don't we make an argument that this is invasion, number one, and what we're seeing now going on in the country is rebellion against the enforcement of immigration laws. We can't do this, at least in holding these people. We'll have the courts clogged forever. So let's see if we can't suspend the writ of habeas corpus, and then tell them, we'll give the people a choice. You can stay in these conditions, humane conditions,
right,
until God knows when you'll come in front of an immigration judge, and then maybe a actual federal. You go through this extremely complicated process, or you can take what's behind door number 3, and that's $1,000 or $1,500 and a plane ticket to Venezuela, to Colombia, to Thailand, wherever you came from. We'll send you there, and we'll give you some money, and we release you immediately. As soon as you sign this paper, we release you immediately and give you the money, put you on a plane, and you'll be gone. Otherwise, you stay here, and we can't tell you when you'll be released, depending on circumstances. When were those people theoretically released that Lincoln had incarcerated?
I don't know.
At the end of the Civil War.
Wow.
Okay.
Okay.
Now, the interesting thing about this, if Trump had Congress behind him, and I don't think he does, but assuming that he did, he could go to them right now and say, listen, I want to issue this proclamation. And what I want you to do is I want you to pass a statute that removes all jurisdiction from the federal courts in hearing any case involved with this proclamation, which Congress can do because the courts have only the jurisdiction that Congress gives them. So if Congress passes a statute tomorrow that says no federal court can hear a case involved with, copyright law, nobody can challenge a copyright law in the courts of the United States. End of it. They don't no longer have jurisdiction. So if they pass a statute that says suspension of privilege, the writ of habeas corpus, and this cannot be challenged in any federal court. No federal court has jurisdiction. That's it. No jurisdiction. And they could say that all the way to the Supreme Court, that nobody can appeal this kind of a case to the Supreme Court because the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is controlled by Congress. Okay? The thing that they couldn't prevent would be an original jurisdiction case, whether some state might sue. Gavin Newsom might sue on behalf of California saying, this is illegal, they can't suspend habeas corpus. That could come in the Supreme Court. So there's no way around that. It would be heard by the court somewhere.
Does that mean that habeas corpus, if a legal case came up like that, does it have to wait, or can habeas corpus?
Oh, that one. If they could if they could find a way to create a case to go to the Supreme Court, that would go right away. Original jurisdiction.
But if they couldn't, could it just block the president from doing that?
If they couldn't,
let's say it takes 2 years,
they couldn't do anything. If Congress passed a statute suspending the writ of habeas corpus, approving what the president wants to do, and said the lower courts have no jurisdiction to hear a case, then no case could be heard.
In the context of immigration.
In the context of immigration.
Okay.
Because, see, the Constitution requires that there be rebellion or invasion for the writ of habeas corpus to be suspended, the privilege to be suspended, the right to go into court and ask for it to be suspended. So you have to make out the case that there's rebellion or insurrection. Well, that's what Lincoln said. There's secession, and they're forming armies down there. Right? This is rebellion. Okay? He suspended the writ of habeas corpus. Congress comes along a little later and says, we ratify what he did. We're proving everything that he did. Well, now we have the problem. What is Trump going to do? And if I were doing this, I'm not suggesting that it's the most prudent thing to do, but if someone said, could you follow what Lincoln did? I'd say, well, yeah, I'd follow what Lincoln did, but I'd first go to my friends in Congress, because I have a majority in Congress, and say, this is what we need to do, because you would know as well as I do that we can't solve this problem otherwise. There's just too many people. Give me a statute. I'll write a proclamation. You limit the jurisdiction of the lower federal courts. You limit the appeal jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. You exclude the jurisdiction of the state courts because this is a federal issue. And the only way that case can get to the Supreme Court would be by original jurisdiction, which would be a state suing. Or maybe some minister. Maybe the minister from Mexico could sue on the basis of Mexican citizens that are being held here. So there are two foreign ministers or the state could sue. And we can't stop that because the Constitution allows that. That's original jurisdiction. And we'll see what happens. And it'll be a good idea to get it to the Supreme Court anyway. Right? And eventually we want it decided. Right? We don't want this left in abeyance so they can call Trump a tyrant. Right? We want the Supreme Court to decide it. But until someone could get it to the Supreme Court, these people could be apprehended by ICE. They could be put into some kind of decent detention. And then, as Trump likes to say, here's the deal. Behind door number 3, we're giving you so much money, we're giving you a handful of money, and we're putting you on a plane, and you can leave immediately. You can walk out of this, you sign the release papers, here's your money, here's your plane ticket, we'll take you to the airport, and you go. How many of those people would not take the money and go, as opposed to sitting in that detention center for the next 2 years or 3 years? Or maybe longer, who knows? Mm-hmm. All right? And I have a feeling that other than kind of the radical people who are in favor of illegal immigration in principle, for whatever reason, they would say, well, at least that's a practical solution. Because, as they used to say, the key to the jailhouse door is in your own hands. You, the immigrant. Mm-hmm. You know you're illegal. You know at some point you're going to be deported. The only reason that you're not getting into the system now is because it is so bloody complicated even to hold you somewhere. And here's your choice. You're going to be in this detention center under, I would assume, decent conditions, and nobody's going to be tyrannized over. All right, you're going to be there. You're going to receive what medical care you need, proper food, proper housing, etc. Now, you're not going to be given college educations or anything else, right? Maybe there's a library. Until your case comes up. And we're just saying we can't control that. There are so many people and only so many agents, so many courts.
That's
right. We can't control it. We can't say how long that will be. And we're giving you the alternative because you know that being an illegal immigrant, you will be deported anyway. The ones where they would have some evidence, we could look at that right away and say, well, the mistake was made. You're not whoever. We arrested the wrong person. You're released, right? But the others know they're illegal. And so they must realize, well, there's no way out for them other than staying here until the process works itself out. But we can get out immediately. Okay. And that's what's going to happen to you anyway. You're going to be forced to leave. You leave with some money and you'll be shipped back to flown back to your own home country.
Do you think that the immigration conditions, laws, the structures can be stripped down and the process made simpler, clearer?
Well, that requires an act of Congress. And I'm just wondering which one is simpler, to try and create a whole new immigration, deportation, due process concept, going through immigration officers and then maybe with appeals into
Seems unbelievably wieldy.
Well, it's unwieldy now.
Yeah.
That's all I'm saying. This thing was never designed to handle an influx of tens of millions of illegal immigrants all at once.
Right.
So either you're going to carry this on for 50 years or longer with all the problems that would involve there and expense and everything else, or you're going to try and cut the Gordian knot, as it were. But to cut the Gordian knot, Trump either has to be someone like Lincoln, who says, I'm going to do this on my own and see what happens. And then they'll claim he's a tyrant, obviously. Or he has to go to Congress and say, give me a piece of legislation that will do this and also prevent these side events from happening, subject to the Supreme Court hearing a case, whenever. And we'll do it, and I can then use the forces that we have, which would be the National Guard helping the immigration authorities, whenever we deal with some kind of disruption. And I would think simply reporting that, you simply tell the illegal alien population, look, this is what's going to happen to you in the long run. Maybe you could go underground. Maybe you can try to avoid this. But please understand, after a certain period of time, if we apprehend anyone who doesn't take this route, we will prosecute you and put you in jail in the United States for a certain number of years before you're deported. All right? We can make it much worse for you. So it's up to you. You know who you are. You know that you're not here legally. And you have to make a choice.
As we close out this meeting.
Oh, by the way, I'm not necessarily proposing this. I think that they've created a situation, especially the Biden administration, has created this condition in which if you're not going to let it drag out far beyond my lifetime, your lifetime, or the lifetime of my grandchildren, something, quote-unquote, radical has to be done. And I leave it to the Trump administration to figure out a prudent and constitutional way to do it. I'm just saying, if you look at the one instance in history where we had something equivalent in terms of a crisis situation, which was secession, right, and then the beginning of the Civil War, how was it dealt with? It was dealt with by Lincoln and then by Congress through suspending the writ of habeas corpus. And that could be a way to solve this problem. A lot of people would scream and yell about it. You'd have a lot of controversy, political controversy. But this is a situation in which political controversy can't be avoided. And I don't know if it could be done. Listen, Trump's administration is not the only problem. Congress is also a problem. Could they pass the right kind of legislation? Maybe not. Maybe it would be another rat's nest, as they've done in many other instances. Could it be properly administered by the immigration bureaucracy, even in line with using the National Guard or whatever, right? Would there be people that would be challenging the conditions of detention, that this was cruel and unusual punishment, due process element there? Yes, they can be denied habeas corpus, but can they be put into filthy prisons with no medical attention, etc.? That's another question, all right? So there are all sorts of ramifications here. And that's why I say, well, I'm not necessarily advocating because it's so damn complicated. I mean, some pretty smart lawyers would have to sit down for a week or so and figure out all the ins and the outs of it and then draft a piece of legislation.
And you don't mean just any lawyers. You mean constitutional lawyers?
Yeah, oh, absolutely.
Okay.
We're talking about a constitutional
I want to be
provision.
clear what lawyers you're referring to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, immigration lawyers as well,
Okay,
because
and
that's part of it,
immigration
right?
lawyers, right.
But we're talking about a constitutional provision which was controversial even in the course of the Civil War, the breakup of the country, what Lincoln did. And it's still controversial today. A lot of people will say, scholars and others, right, people who investigate, well, Lincoln was wrong. He shouldn't have been allowed to do that. Right? And others will say, yes, he was entitled to do that because of this, that, and the other thing. So that's an opening, but it would require some very astute people spending a sufficient amount of time figuring out all the ramifications of it and then, following through, not doing what the Trump administration seems to do many times. They take a few halting steps first in a direction, then they back off and try to go another direction, and then whatever. And so they're running around like blind man's bluff, where they're wearing, a hood and trying to catch the grandchildren who were poking them in the yard, right? You've seen that game being played, right? And I mean, right now, I don't know if they have the talent to do it.
The talent or the
will too,
and the spirit to do
and the
it
spirit
right
to do
now
it.
with what's
Because if you look at the way they're responding to these violent demonstrations, or whatever you want to call them, that are going on and will be going on more so than now, I think they're really not making the case to the American people about the legitimacy of what the Trump administration is doing.
And that's because I believe most of them are not trained in the Constitution. And even a lot of the constitutional lawyers, I don't think they're surrounding him.
Well, also in the statute. I mean, this statute that I've read 3 or 4 times here, Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253, is absolutely clear on its face as to what the president has the power to do, especially when the state officials are, waffling or failing to exercise their authority. And in the case of maybe Newsom saying, well, we're not going to do it. Right? I mean, they're taking an intransigent stand and a fuscatory stand. And that's exactly what the statute is designed to deal with when the state officials are not performing appropriate functions, fulfilling their duties. So I'm just surprised that someone like Trump, or maybe not Trump, he's not the lawyer, but let's take Bondi, Attorney General. Yeah. Why isn't she out there saying, here's the statute, and you have a big thing that shows up in the back?
Well, she may not know the statute. Like I said, just because you're an attorney doesn't mean you're grounded in constitutional law.
Hey, I found it. She can find it.
But that's your specialty, though. Sir.
No. I found it. She can find it. All right. Power of the president to deal with this kind of situation. It's right there in Title 10. And there are other people talking about it. Who did I hear the other day? Colonel Douglas McGregor. I don't know if you know him.
Of course.
Okay. Colonel Douglas McGregor. He's on all the time. And he was talking about the power of the president under the Insurrection Act. And that's what they normally give the name to the first section in this part, which is, 251. All right? But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this specific provision here. So, all right, there are some people out there already saying, Insurrection Act. Okay, look up the statute. You don't need to be a lawyer to look up the statute. Put Federal Insurrection Act into Google, and up will come these statutes immediately, the 4 or 5 of them, and just read them. They're not that long. And then you get to 253, Title 10 of the United States Code, Section 253. It's exactly this situation. State officials not performing their function, domestic violence, conspiracy, so forth and so on. President has the authority, when he makes the determination himself, to use the militia, the armed forces, or by any other means. I love that one. By any other means. What might that be? Goodness gracious. Congress has given him this authority. And if you ask how far does his decision go, well, then you have to be a constitutional lawyer because you have to know about Martin versus Mott. Right? You'd have to look up. Actually, you would find that if you went to the U.S. Code Annotated, which has a collection of the judicial decisions under various statutes, it would have a historical note of some kind. It would take you back to these earlier Supreme Court decisions. You'd find it if you know what you were doing. Certainly any lawyer in the Justice Department ought to be able to find it because you taught legal research in law school. You taught how to use the statute books, all right? And Mrs. Bondi was Attorney General in Florida, so, she's not someone just off the bus, as they used to say, off the last boat from Albania. She just arrived here, and they put her in that office. And she has professionals working under her in any event. If she didn't know, they'd find it 4.5 hours, 15 minutes maybe. So I'm just surprised that the Trump administration has not come out and said, here is this, you're telling me I'm a tyrant. Here is the statute I am using. Read it. I'll read it to you. And here is the Supreme Court decision from 1827 on exactly the same point that makes out in clearest terminology that I am the final determinator of when this kind of authority should be used, and no one can second-guess me. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, for your attention. And he signs off.
Edwin Vieira, it's great to see you.
Well, thank you very much. I hope I haven't, upset too many people's equilibrium.
Well, it requires a lot of critical thinking and receptivity and learning because look at the 56 years in this space.
Yeah.
I really appreciate you being here. And ladies and gentlemen, I want you to go to rainmakingtime.com or .ch if you would like to sponsor any of these shows or contribute. We really appreciate any contributions you can make, any donations that you could make. It will make this show go more viral, more public, to more distribution of people who really need to hear this, particularly in the United States. And for those of you who are interested outside the United States, it's a real lesson in constitutional history of this country. So thank you very much for being here. God bless you. And I look forward to hearing from the public if they'd like to go live with you and get their questions answered. Thanks so much.
Thank you.